England is a country shaped by rolling green meadows, ancient traditions, and some of the most influential figures in Western history. It is the land forever linked with the legendary King Arthur and the very real King Alfred, the birthplace of the common law tradition and the jury system, and the homeland of a language that would eventually spread across every continent. Yet, the England we recognize today did not emerge overnight. It was forged over centuries through invasion, conflict, adaptation, and cultural exchange. To understand how England came into existence, we must travel back more than 1,000 years, to an age when the island was divided among competing kingdoms and threatened by constant invasion. The centuries leading up to the Norman Conquest were among the most dramatic in English history. Between the end of Roman rule and the arrival of William the Conqueror, the island witnessed the rise of new peoples, the collapse of old powers, and the birth of a nation. Around the year 1000, the inhabitants of England were heirs to a remarkably diverse heritage. Their society blended the traditions of the native Britons, the administrative legacy of Rome, the customs of the Anglo-Saxons, and the influence of Scandinavian settlers. None of these cultures completely replaced the others. Instead, each left its mark, gradually creating a distinctly English identity. Long before England existed as a kingdom, the island was inhabited by Celtic-speaking Britons. Much about their daily lives remains uncertain because they left behind relatively few written records. What historians know comes largely from Roman writers, whose descriptions were often shaped by political propaganda. According to these accounts, some British tribes practiced ritual sacrifices and decorated their bodies with elaborate paint before entering battle. The Roman Empire invaded Britain during the reign of Emperor Claudius in the 1st century AD. Southern Britain soon became an important Roman province filled with roads, towns, forts, and public buildings. Roman engineers transformed much of the landscape, while Roman law and administration introduced a new level of political organization. Yet Roman control never extended across the entire island. Scotland remained beyond imperial authority, and Ireland was never conquered. After nearly 4 centuries, the Roman Empire faced growing threats across Europe. Barbarian invasions, internal instability, and military crises forced Rome to concentrate its resources elsewhere. Around AD 410, Roman legions were withdrawn from Britain, ending centuries of imperial protection. For many Romano-British communities, this departure came as a devastating shock. They had grown accustomed to Roman government and military security, and suddenly they found themselves alone. Without Roman armies guarding the frontiers, Britain became vulnerable to attacks from across the North Sea. Several Germanic peoples began crossing into the island, including the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. At first, they may have arrived as hired warriors defending local rulers, but before long they established their own settlements and kingdoms. Gradually, they expanded their control over much of southern and eastern Britain. Among these newcomers, the Angles and Saxons became the dominant groups. Their influence proved so significant that the land itself eventually became known as England, literally meaning the land of the Angles. As generations passed, the descendants of these settlers mixed with surviving Britons, creating entirely new communities rather than remaining separate peoples. This turbulent period also gave birth to one of history's greatest legends. According to medieval tradition, a heroic British leader named Arthur resisted the Anglo-Saxon advance, defending his homeland against overwhelming odds. Although historians have never found conclusive evidence proving Arthur's existence, the legend became deeply woven into English culture. Stories describe Camelot as the center of a noble kingdom where courageous knights gathered around the famous Round Table, a symbol of honor, justice, and equality. Whether Arthur was inspired by a real military commander or created entirely through legend, his story endured because it represented ideals that people longed to believe in. Courage, loyalty, sacrifice, and the defense of one's homeland became permanent themes associated with his name. Even centuries later, many believed that Arthur had not truly died, but was merely waiting beneath the soil of Britain until the nation once again needed its greatest protector. While Arthur belongs largely to legend, another English hero stands firmly in recorded history. King Alfred of Wessex became one of the most important rulers England ever produced. Unlike the mythical king, Alfred's achievements can be traced through historical documents that reveal both his military skill and his intellectual curiosity. By the 8th century, Anglo-Saxon England had developed into a vibrant Christian society. Monasteries became centers of learning where monks copied books by hand, preserved ancient knowledge, and created beautifully decorated manuscripts admired throughout Europe. One of the most famous religious centers stood on the small island of Lindisfarne off England's northeastern coast. Among England's greatest scholars was the monk known as the Venerable Bede. His historical writings became foundational works for medieval Europe, and his use of dating years from the birth of Christ helped popularize the calendar system that much of the world still follows today. Yet just as England was entering a period of cultural and religious achievement, a terrifying new threat appeared across the sea. In AD 793, warriors from Scandinavia launched a surprise attack on the monastery at Lindisfarne. The assault shocked Christian Europe. Sacred buildings were looted, monks were killed, and priceless treasures disappeared. Contemporary chroniclers described strange omens appearing before the disaster, believing that heaven itself had warned of the catastrophe. For later generations, the raid marked the beginning of the Viking Age in Britain. The people responsible for these attacks are known today by several different names. Historians refer to them as Vikings, Norsemen, Scandinavians, or Northmen. Depending on their homeland, they may also be identified more specifically as Danes, Norwegians, or Swedes. Whatever name is used, they became some of the most feared warriors of the early Middle Ages. Popular imagination often remembers Vikings only as savage raiders, arriving in dragon-headed ships to burn villages and seize treasure. The reality, however, was far more complex. They were also skilled sailors, explorers, merchants, and settlers whose voyages stretched from North America to the Middle East. Nevertheless, their raids brought enormous suffering to many European communities. Historians continue debating why Viking expansion began during the late 8th century. Some argue that population growth placed increasing pressure on Scandinavian resources, encouraging young warriors to seek wealth overseas. Others believe improvements in shipbuilding and navigation simply opened opportunities that ambitious leaders eagerly exploited. Whatever the cause, Viking fleets soon appeared along the coastlines of England, Scotland, Ireland, France, Germany, and the Low Countries. The speed of these attacks made them exceptionally difficult to stop. Viking longships could cross open seas, navigate shallow rivers, and land almost anywhere along a coastline. Communities often received little warning before heavily armed warriors emerged from the mist, struck with devastating force, and disappeared before organized resistance could form. Adding to their fearsome reputation were elite fighters remembered as berserkers. According to medieval accounts, these warriors entered battle in an almost uncontrollable state of fury. Armed with massive axes and inspired by devotion to gods such as Odin and Thor, they charged directly into enemy lines with terrifying determination. Whether every story about them was true or partly exaggerated, their psychological impact alone often caused defenders to flee before the fighting even began. Meanwhile, continental Europe struggled with its own political problems. Following the death of the great Emperor Charlemagne in AD 814, his enormous empire gradually fragmented. By 843, his grandsons had divided the realm into separate kingdoms, weakening central authority across Western Europe. The resulting instability created ideal conditions for repeated Viking raids, leaving many regions vulnerable throughout the 9th century. England, however, eventually found a leader capable of resisting this growing danger. Born around AD 849, Alfred was the youngest son of the King of Wessex. Few expected him to inherit the throne, but a series of unexpected events placed the kingdom in his hands during one of its darkest moments. Danish armies had already conquered vast portions of England, and many believed complete Scandinavian domination was inevitable. Desperate Anglo-Saxon rulers often chose to buy temporary peace instead of fighting. They paid enormous sums of gold, known as Danegeld, hoping the Vikings would leave their territories untouched. In reality, these payments usually encouraged further attacks. Successful raids convinced Scandinavian leaders that England was both wealthy and vulnerable, making it an even more attractive target. Many Danish settlers established permanent communities across eastern and northern England, creating what became known as the Danelaw. Rather than simply raiding and departing, they farmed the land, built towns, traded with local populations, and permanently reshaped English society. Alfred understood that paying tribute alone would never secure lasting peace. Instead, he reorganized his kingdom's defenses and introduced military reforms that transformed Wessex into a far stronger state. One of his greatest innovations was the development of an English naval force capable of challenging Viking ships before they reached the coast. This marked one of the earliest foundations of what would eventually become the Royal Navy. On land, Alfred strengthened fortifications, improved communication between defensive positions, and created a more organized military system that allowed his forces to respond quickly to Viking invasions. These reforms gradually shifted the balance of power. Although Alfred never completely expelled the Danes from England, he prevented them from conquering the entire island. By the time of his death in AD 899, Viking-controlled territory had been significantly reduced, and Wessex had emerged as the strongest Anglo-Saxon kingdom. More importantly, Alfred laid the foundations for a united English monarchy, transforming what had once been a collection of rival kingdoms into the beginning of a single English nation. His victories accomplished far more than military success. They preserved Anglo-Saxon culture, protected Christian learning, and created the political stability that allowed England to continue developing into one of medieval Europe's most influential kingdoms. Without Alfred's leadership, the history of England, and perhaps even the English language itself, might have taken a completely different path. When Alfred the Great died in AD 899, he left behind far more than military victories. He had preserved the independence of Wessex, strengthened its defenses, and inspired a growing sense of unity among the English kingdoms. To many of his contemporaries, Alfred and his descendants became the rightful protectors of the Anglo-Saxon people and the guardians of their culture. His achievements established a foundation that later rulers would continue to build upon. Over the following decades, Alfred's successors steadily expanded their influence across the island. What had once been a collection of competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms gradually evolved into a more centralized realm. The kings who inherited Alfred's throne were no longer seen merely as rulers of Wessex. Increasingly, they were recognized as kings of the English people. By the middle of the 10th century, this transformation was largely complete. Royal authority stretched across most of what is now England, from the rugged coastline of Cornwall in the southwest to Dover and Canterbury in the southeast, while extending north toward Berwick-on-Tweed. Even neighboring rulers in Scotland and Wales acknowledged, at least politically, the growing dominance of the English crown. Although regional identities remained strong, England had begun to emerge as a recognizable kingdom. This period of relative stability, however, would not last forever. Toward the end of the 10th century, England entered another era of uncertainty with the accession of King Ethelred. History remembers him by the famous nickname Ethelred the Unready, though the title is somewhat misleading. Rather than suggesting laziness or cowardice, the Old English expression meant someone who was poorly advised or lacking wise counsel. Unfortunately for England, the description proved remarkably appropriate. Ethelred inherited a kingdom that faced increasing pressure from across the North Sea. Viking attacks, which Alfred had spent years containing, began to intensify once again. Danish fleets returned with greater numbers, better organization, and far more ambitious goals. No longer satisfied with quick raids for treasure, many now intended to conquer territory permanently. Unlike Alfred, Ethelred struggled to respond effectively to these growing threats. His reign was marked by indecision, political disagreements, and military setbacks. England possessed wealth and manpower, yet its leadership repeatedly failed to coordinate an effective defense against increasingly determined Scandinavian armies. Contemporary chroniclers paint a vivid picture of these troubled years. They describe royal expeditions that accomplished little while enemy fleets moved freely around Britain's coastlines. On one occasion, English forces attempted campaigns in the northwest as Danish raiders redirected their attention toward Normandy across the Channel. These accounts reveal how fluid warfare had become. Viking commanders could strike one coastline, disappear across open water, and attack somewhere entirely different before local rulers had time to react. By this stage, England had become painfully familiar with seaborne invasions. For more than 2 centuries, Viking ships had appeared with alarming regularity, attacking monasteries, villages, trading ports, and royal estates. Every coastal settlement understood that danger might arrive without warning. Faced with this relentless pressure, Ethelred's government revived a policy that many hoped would buy peace. Rather than fighting every invasion, royal advisors negotiated directly with Viking leaders, offering enormous payments of silver in exchange for their departure. These tribute payments became known as Dangeld. In one famous agreement, English authorities handed over an astonishing 24,000 pounds of silver to the Danish forces. It was an immense sum, representing one of the largest ransom payments in medieval Europe. The expectation was simple. The Vikings would accept the treasure and leave England in peace. The strategy failed. Instead of discouraging future invasions, these payments convinced Scandinavian leaders that England possessed extraordinary wealth. If one expedition could secure such riches, another might gain even more. Danegeld gradually became less a solution than an invitation for further attacks. Yet another event during the same year would ultimately reshape English history even more profoundly than the payment itself. In AD 1002, a young Norman noblewoman named Emma arrived in England to marry King Ethelred. Known in some sources as Imma or Elfgifu after her marriage, she was the daughter of Duke Richard of Normandy, one of the most powerful rulers in northern France. At first glance, the marriage appeared to be a diplomatic alliance intended to strengthen relations across the English Channel. Few could have predicted how significant this union would become. Emma's arrival established a direct dynastic connection between the English royal family and the ruling house of Normandy, a connection that would later provide the legal and political justification for one of history's most famous invasions. To understand why this marriage mattered so much, it is necessary to look across the Channel to Normandy itself. The very name Normandy means land of the Northmen, a reminder of its Viking origins. Less than a century earlier, the region had been repeatedly attacked by Scandinavian raiders. Rather than continuing endless warfare, the French king Charles III adopted a different strategy. In AD 911, he negotiated with a powerful Viking leader named Rollo, who had established himself near the mouth of the Seine River. Instead of attempting to drive the Norse warriors away, Charles offered Rollo land in return for loyalty and military service. The agreement transformed a feared invader into a legitimate nobleman. Rollo accepted Christianity, became Duke of Normandy, and pledged to defend the kingdom against future Viking attacks. The arrangement proved remarkably successful. Over the following generations, Rollo's descendants gradually adopted the French language, embraced Christianity, and integrated into European aristocratic society. Although they retained their Viking determination and military traditions, they increasingly viewed themselves as French nobles rather than Scandinavian raiders. Rollo's son, William Longsword, expanded Norman authority, while his grandson, Richard the Fearless, strengthened the duchy's political stability. Richard's own son, Richard II, inherited one of the wealthiest and most organized territories in northern France. It was within this influential Norman dynasty that Emma was born. Her marriage to Ethelred represented the first time in generations that an English king had chosen a bride from outside his own kingdom. While politically important, the marriage itself appears to have been far from harmonious. Historical evidence suggests that the royal couple shared little affection for one another. Although they produced 2 sons, Edward and Alfred, tensions within the royal household reflected broader political divisions affecting the kingdom. At a time when England desperately required strong and united leadership, the monarchy instead became associated with internal conflict and uncertainty. Meanwhile, the Danish threat continued to grow. By the second decade of the 11th century, Danish ambitions had expanded beyond seasonal raiding. Their objective was no longer simply to plunder England's wealth, but to seize the kingdom itself. Leading this campaign was one of the greatest military commanders of the Viking Age, King Canute of Denmark, better known in English history as Canute. Unlike many earlier Viking leaders, Canute combined strategic planning with remarkable political skill. He organized massive invasion fleets, gathered experienced warriors from across Scandinavia, and carefully coordinated his campaigns. Rather than relying solely on surprise attacks, he sought complete conquest. His armies advanced relentlessly through England, burning settlements, destroying crops, and overwhelming resistance wherever they encountered it. Contemporary chroniclers describe entire regions being devastated as Danish forces moved from one county to another, leaving destruction in their wake. As this crisis unfolded, England suffered another devastating blow. King Ethelred died before the decisive struggle for the kingdom had reached its conclusion. His long reign ended after years marked by invasion, political instability, and repeated military failures. For many contemporaries, his death symbolized the collapse of an era. The responsibility for defending England now fell to his son Edmund, remembered by history as Edmund Ironside. Unlike his father, Edmund possessed both courage and military ability. He quickly emerged as a determined leader capable of rallying Anglo-Saxon resistance against the Danish advance. Several fierce battles followed, with Edmund repeatedly challenging Cnut's armies across southern England. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the English kingdom might yet survive. But fate intervened. In AD 1016, Edmund died after only a short reign. Whether weakened by wounds, illness, or other causes, his death removed the last serious obstacle to Danish victory. With Edmund gone and Ethelred's remaining heirs forced into exile, organized resistance effectively collapsed. There was no longer anyone capable of challenging Cnut's claim to the English throne. Cnut became King of England, bringing an end to centuries of uninterrupted Anglo-Saxon royal rule descending from Alfred the Great. The ancient dynasty that had united England appeared to have reached its conclusion. For many observers, it seemed that England's future no longer lay with its native kings, but with a new Scandinavian empire stretching across the North Sea. Under Cnut's rule, England, Denmark, and eventually Norway would be connected under a single crown, creating one of the most powerful kingdoms in Northern Europe. Yet history was far from finished. The dynastic ties created by Emma of Normandy, the ambitions of powerful nobles across the Channel, and the uncertain succession after Cnut's descendants would soon open the door to another dramatic struggle for England, one that would ultimately culminate in the unforgettable events of 1066. Canute had conquered England by force, but he understood that a kingdom could not be ruled by the sword alone. If he wished to remain on the throne, he needed to present himself not merely as a Danish conqueror, but as a legitimate English king. That required compromise, political intelligence, and a careful respect for the customs of the people he now governed. One of his most important decisions came in 1017, when he married Emma of Normandy, the widow of King Ethelred. The marriage connected Canute to the former royal house and gave his new regime a sense of continuity. Emma had already given Ethelred 2 sons, Edward and Alfred, both of whom were living in exile. Her union with Canute produced additional children, including Harthacnut and Gunhilda. Through Emma, several different royal bloodlines were now tied together, creating both opportunity and future confusion over the English succession. The relationship between Emma and Canute appears to have been far more successful than her earlier marriage. She became an important figure at court and participated actively in the image of the new monarchy. Their public appearances presented them as Christian rulers rather than foreign occupiers. In religious art, they were portrayed offering gifts to churches and supporting the spiritual life of the kingdom. Canute's reign might easily have descended into rebellion and disorder. He was a foreign ruler who had taken the throne after years of invasion, bloodshed, and dynastic conflict. Yet instead of governing England as a conquered province, he proved to be one of the most capable rulers of the early 11th century. Once his position was secure, Canute dismissed much of the large Scandinavian force that had helped him win the kingdom. Maintaining such an army would have been expensive, and its presence might have encouraged hostility among the English population. In its place, he relied on a smaller body of highly trained professional warriors known as housecarls. These men formed the heart of the royal military household. Heavily armed and fiercely loyal, they were famous for carrying long, two-handed axes capable of breaking shields and cutting through armor. The housecarls were not temporary soldiers called into service during emergencies. They were experienced retainers who lived close to the king and depended directly on him for status, wealth, and protection. In time, they would become one of the most respected elements of the English army. Canute also proved remarkably skilled in diplomacy. He worked with English nobles, supported the church, respected established laws, and avoided unnecessarily disturbing the existing structure of government. Rather than destroying Anglo-Saxon institutions, he used them. This approach allowed him to rule a divided land with a degree of stability that had been absent during much of Ethelred's reign. His authority eventually extended far beyond England. Through conquest, inheritance, and political alliances, Canute became ruler of Denmark and Norway as well. At the height of his power, he controlled a vast northern empire stretching across the North Sea. England was no longer merely a target of Scandinavian invasion. It had become one of the centers of a powerful maritime realm. Yet, one of the most famous stories about Canute is not concerned with military victory or imperial ambition. Instead, it presents him as a ruler who understood the limitations of earthly power. According to the traditional account, Canute once sat on the shore while the tide was rising. Around him stood courtiers who praised him extravagantly, claiming that his authority was so great that even nature itself must obey him. Canute decided to expose the foolishness of their flattery. He ordered the sea to stop advancing. The tide, of course, ignored the command. The water continued moving toward the shore until it washed around the king's feet. Canute then turned to his advisors and reminded them that no human ruler, however powerful, could command the natural world. Kings possessed authority over men, but not over creation itself. The story has often been misunderstood as an example of Canute's arrogance. In reality, it was meant to show the opposite. He was demonstrating humility and mocking those who exaggerated his power. The tale survived because it captured an important element of medieval kingship. A ruler could be mighty, but he remained subject to forces greater than himself. Canute died in 1035, and the stability he had created began to unravel almost immediately. The question of succession became complicated by the existence of several potential heirs from different relationships and competing branches of the royal family. Emma hoped that her son Arthur Canute would inherit the English throne. At the time of Canute's death, however, Arthur Canute was occupied in Denmark and could not immediately secure his position in England. Another of Canute's sons, Harald Harefoot, took advantage of the situation and established control over much of the kingdom. For a time, England was divided between rival interests. Harold eventually became the effective ruler, while Emma struggled to preserve Arthur Canute's claim. The political conflict placed her in an increasingly dangerous position, and she was eventually forced to leave England. Harald Harefoot's reign was brief. He died in 1040, allowing Arthur Canute to cross from Denmark and take the English throne without serious opposition. Yet Arthur Canute's rule was also short and unpopular. Heavy taxation and his continued reliance on a large fleet damaged his standing among the English people. When Arthur Canute died suddenly in 1042, the direct Scandinavian royal line in England collapsed. The kingdom now turned back to the older house of Wessex. The man chosen as king was Edward, the surviving son of Ethelred and Emma. He had spent much of his life in Normandy, far from the land he was now expected to govern. His return restored Alfred's dynasty, at least temporarily, and many English subjects welcomed the revival of the ancient royal house. Edward became known to history as Edward the Confessor, a title reflecting his reputation for religious devotion rather than martyrdom. He was remembered as a deeply pious ruler who attended religious ceremonies, supported churches, and lived with an air of spiritual seriousness. His government was generally more stable than the final years of Ethelred's reign, but Edward faced a difficult political environment. England was dominated by powerful regional earls whose wealth and military influence could rival that of the crown. The king therefore had to balance competing noble families while also managing the cultural divisions between English and Norman interests. Edward understood that he could not ignore the Scandinavian population that had settled in England over the previous generations. Danish customs and families were now deeply established, particularly in the eastern and northern parts of the kingdom. He ruled carefully enough to avoid provoking widespread hostility among them. At the same time, Edward showed a clear preference for Normandy. He had spent his formative years there, surrounded by Norman nobles, clergy, architecture, and courtly traditions. As king, he invited several Normans into England and appointed some of them to influential religious and political positions. Norman churchmen were given important offices, Norman advisors appeared at court. Even architectural styles from across the Channel began to influence royal construction. Edward's most famous building project, Westminster Abbey, reflected many of these continental ideas. To some English nobles, the growing Norman presence was deeply troubling. They feared that foreigners were gaining influence over the king and receiving positions that should have gone to established Anglo-Saxon families. The most powerful opponent of Norman influence was Earl Godwin of Wessex. Godwin's origins remain uncertain. His enemies later mocked him as a man of humble birth, perhaps even the son of a herdsman. Whether these claims contained any truth is difficult to determine. What is clear is that Godwin possessed extraordinary political ability. He had risen to prominence under Canute and managed to retain influence through the reigns of Canute's sons. By the time Edward became king, Godwin was the most powerful nobleman in England. As Earl of Wessex, he controlled vast territories, commanded considerable military resources, and stood second only to the king. Edward could not govern effectively without taking Godwin's power into account. Their relationship was therefore based on both cooperation and suspicion. Godwin needed the king to preserve his legitimacy, while Edward needed Godwin to maintain order in the kingdom. The alliance between the two men was strengthened in 1045 when Edward married Godwin's daughter, Edith. Edith was educated, intelligent, and raised within one of England's most influential households. Her marriage placed the Godwin family at the center of royal politics. Yet the union did not produce the heir that England desperately needed. Edward and Edith remained childless throughout their marriage. Medieval writers offered various explanations. Some portrayed Edward as having chosen a life of religious celibacy, while others suggested that the marriage lacked affection or intimacy. In later stories, Edward reportedly treated Edith more like a sister than a wife. Whatever the true nature of their relationship, their failure to produce children created a growing political crisis. In a hereditary monarchy, an uncertain succession could lead to rebellion, foreign intervention, or civil war. As Edward grew older, the question of who would follow him became impossible to ignore. Emma of Normandy, meanwhile, experienced a dramatic decline in influence after her son became king. She had once stood at the heart of English government as the wife of two kings and the mother of two more. Under Canute, she had possessed wealth, estates, and considerable political authority. Edward, however, appears to have regarded his mother with suspicion and resentment. Soon after taking the throne, he deprived Emma of much of her property and removed her from political life. Some chroniclers believe that he blamed her for supporting Canute over him during the earlier succession struggles. Emma spent her final years away from the center of power. She died at Winchester in 1052 and was buried beside Canute, the husband with whom she had shared the most successful period of her political life. Queen Edith followed a very different path. Though her marriage to Edward may have lacked warmth, she remained publicly loyal to him. After his death, she helped shape the memory of his reign by supporting an account that presented Edward as a wise and saintly ruler. Through this portrayal, she contributed significantly to the royal image that later generations inherited. The delicate balance of Edward's court began to change after the death of Earl Godwin in 1053. His position and influence passed largely to his sons, especially Harold Godwinson. Harold quickly emerged as one of the most capable political and military leaders in England. He inherited the family's power, commanded the loyalty of many nobles, and became the dominant figure in Edward's government. While Edward remained king, Harold increasingly acted as the kingdom's chief defender and practical administrator. As the years passed and Edward remained childless, many began to suspect that Harold intended to take the crown after the king's death. To his supporters, he was the obvious choice. He was English, experienced, wealthy, and capable of protecting the realm. To his opponents, however, his ambitions threatened to turn the succession into a struggle between rival aristocratic families. The Godwins were not the only powerful house in England. The family of Leofric controlled large territories in the Midlands and possessed its own political ambitions. A conflict between these great families could tear the kingdom apart. The danger did not come solely from within England. Across the Channel, Duke William of Normandy was also watching Edward's court with intense interest. William was related to Edward through Emma's Norman family and later claimed that Edward had promised him the English throne. Whether such a promise was ever clearly made remains uncertain. Norman sources insisted that William had been chosen as heir, while English accounts gave little support to this claim. To William, however, family connection, alleged promises, and political opportunity were sufficient foundations for ambition. Normandy had become one of the strongest military powers in northern France, and its duke was not a man inclined to abandon a valuable claim. Far to the north, another formidable contender was preparing his own argument. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, believed that earlier agreements among Scandinavian rulers gave him a legitimate right to England. He was one of the most experienced warriors of his age, a veteran of battles fought from northern Europe to the Byzantine world. His claim may have appeared distant, but the army behind it was very real. Thus, during the final years of Edward's reign, the English crown was surrounded by uncertainty. Harold Godwinson stood at the center of English political power. William of Normandy claimed the kingdom through blood and promise. Harald Hardrada looked back to the Scandinavian empire of Canute and saw England as part of his inheritance. At the heart of the coming crisis was an event later immortalized in one of the most extraordinary works of medieval art, the Bayeux Tapestry. Despite its name, the Bayeux Tapestry is not technically a tapestry. It is a long piece of embroidered cloth, stretching roughly 70 meters, on which dozens of scenes portray the events leading to the Norman Conquest. The work was probably produced within a generation of 1066. Although the identity of its creators remains uncertain, it may have been commissioned by Bishop Odo of Bayeux, William's half-brother, and one of the leading figures of the conquest. Many scholars believe it was embroidered by English craftsmen, possibly in Canterbury, before being taken to Normandy. The scenes unfold like a medieval visual chronicle. Kings hold council, messengers cross the sea, nobles swear oaths, armies march, ships are built, and warriors meet in battle. Short Latin captions guide the viewer through the story, while the borders are filled with animals, symbols, and mysterious images. The tapestry does not offer a neutral account. It tells the story largely from the Norman perspective, presenting William's claim as legitimate and Harold's actions as a betrayal. Even so, its images contain details about clothing, weapons, ships, ceremonies, architecture, and warfare that make it one of the most valuable surviving sources for the 11th century. One of its central episodes concerns Harold Godwinson's journey to Normandy. According to the Norman interpretation, King Edward sent Harold across the Channel on an official mission. During the voyage, Harold was captured by a local count and later released through William's intervention. He then spent time at the Norman court and accompanied William on a military campaign. The most important moment came when Harold allegedly swore a solemn oath to support William's claim to the English throne. In the tapestry, Harold is shown placing his hands upon sacred objects while William watches. The Latin inscription declares that Harold made an oath to Duke William. For the Normans, this scene became the moral foundation of the conquest. When Harold later accepted the crown of England, William could portray him not simply as a political rival, but as a perjurer who had broken a sacred promise. Yet the true meaning of the oath remains one of the great mysteries of the period. Harold may have been acting under pressure. He may not have known that holy relics were hidden beneath the surface on which he swore. The promise itself may have concerned something far less significant than the English succession. Whatever actually happened, William would use the oath with devastating effectiveness. It gave his invasion the appearance of justice, allowed him to seek religious approval, and transformed a dynastic dispute into a sacred cause. The struggle for England was no longer approaching quietly. Three powerful men now stood in the shadow of an aging, childless king, each believing that the crown belonged to him. Edward the Confessor's death would not merely end a reign. It would open the door to invasion, betrayal, and one of the most decisive years in European history. The Bayeux Tapestry is far more than a decorative account of conquest. It is an enormous visual narrative crowded with people, horses, hunting dogs, ships, fortresses, churches, trees, and strange creatures woven into its borders. Hundreds of individual figures move across the cloth, while brief Latin inscriptions guide the viewer from one episode to the next. Together, these scenes create one of the most vivid surviving windows into the political world of 11th century England and Normandy. The story begins before the crisis of 1066, during the final years of Edward the Confessor's reign. In the opening scene, the aging king sits before Earl Harold Godwinson and appears to give him an important command. The tapestry does not reveal what Edward actually says, and that silence has created centuries of debate. Was Harold being sent to Normandy as the king's official representative? Was he carrying a message concerning the English succession? Or was his journey personal, perhaps connected to relatives or political hostages held across the Channel? The images provide clues, but no definite answer. Harold leaves the royal court accompanied by mounted companions. A hawk rests on his wrist, while hunting dogs run beside the horses. Such details suggest a noble expedition rather than an urgent diplomatic mission. Hunting birds and hounds were powerful symbols of aristocratic status, and their presence gives the departure an almost relaxed appearance. Yet what begins like a journey of privilege will soon become one of the most consequential voyages in English history. Harold first travels to Bosham, an estate on the southern coast of England that belonged to him. There, he and one of his companions enter a church and raise their hands in prayer. The scene is simple but mysterious. Perhaps Harold was asking for protection before crossing the Channel. Perhaps the artist wished to emphasize his religious devotion. It may also have been intended as a quiet warning that the journey ahead carried dangers he could not yet see. The next scene shows Harold's household gathered for a feast. Cups and drinking horns pass between the guests, food is placed before them, and most of the men appear absorbed in the celebration. At the far edge of the table, however, one figure points toward the sea, reminding the company that the moment of departure has arrived. The mixture of prayer, feasting, hunting animals, and travel makes Harold's original purpose difficult to determine. The tapestry seems almost deliberately vague. It presents the journey in detail while refusing to explain why it was undertaken. Harold and his men then wade through shallow water toward their ship. Their horses, hounds, weapons, and equipment are carried aboard. The vessel resembles the longships used throughout northern Europe, a reminder that English naval traditions had been shaped by centuries of Scandinavian influence. At first, the crew uses poles and oars to move through the shallow coastal waters. Once the ship reaches the open sea, the square sail is raised, filling with wind as the vessel crosses the English Channel. The men now appear more purposeful. Earlier scenes showed them scattered, uncertain, or occupied with private activities. At sea, they move as a single group. Their journey has finally begun. As the ship approaches the French coast, a sailor prepares the anchor. The vessel reaches land safely, and nothing in the scene suggests a shipwreck or disaster. Yet almost immediately, Harold's position changes. He and his companions are seized by Guy, Count of Ponthieu, a local lord whose lands lay along the coast. Harold was not an unknown traveler. He was one of the most powerful men in England, a leading earl and a central figure in the government of King Edward. Arresting such a man was a bold and potentially dangerous act. Why Guy detained him remains uncertain. Medieval coastal lords sometimes claimed rights over shipwrecked travelers and their possessions, but Harold's vessel had apparently landed without serious damage, making that explanation unconvincing. It is possible that Guy saw an opportunity to demand a ransom. It is equally possible that Duke William of Normandy had already ordered his vassals to watch for Harold's arrival. Whatever the reason, the tapestry next presents Harold as a prisoner. News of the capture soon reaches William, Duke of Normandy. William demands that the English earl be released into his custody. Messengers move between the two courts, and eventually Guy brings Harold to the frontier, where the captive is formally handed over to the Norman Duke. This transfer changes Harold's circumstances, but it does not necessarily restore his freedom. He is no longer shown as a prisoner in chains, yet neither does he appear free to return home. From this point onward, Harold becomes attached to William's court. He travels with the Duke, attends his councils, and takes part in Norman affairs. One scene shows William seated in authority while Harold stands before him, speaking with animated gestures. The visual arrangement makes the balance of power unmistakable. William occupies the position of command. Harold, although a great English nobleman, appears as the man seeking permission, protection, or release. The tapestry again offers no explanation. Harold may have been requesting the right to return to England. He may have been discussing King Edward's wishes. He may have been negotiating the release of English hostages. The absence of words leaves the viewer dependent on gesture and position. The story then moves away from the court and into a military campaign. William leads an army westward against Conan II, Duke of Brittany. Harold accompanies the Norman forces, suggesting that he was now expected to behave as one of William's allies. The army marches toward Mont Saint-Michel, whose famous monastery appears in one of the earliest surviving artistic representations of the site. The troops must cross dangerous coastal ground where shifting sand, deep water, and sudden tides could easily kill heavily armed men. During the crossing, 2 Norman soldiers become trapped and begin sinking. Harold reacts immediately. The tapestry shows him entering the dangerous ground and pulling the men to safety. One soldier is lifted across his shoulders while another clings to him. The moment presents Harold as physically powerful, fearless, and decisive. He is not merely a nobleman of rank, but a warrior willing to risk his life for others. William may have admired these qualities. He may also have remembered them later when the 2 men faced each other as enemies. The Breton campaign ends successfully, and Harold's relationship with William appears to deepen. In a highly significant scene, the Norman Duke presents him with arms. The gift of weapons was not a casual gesture. In medieval political culture, such a ceremony could represent the formation of a formal bond between a lord and his follower. By receiving weapons from William, Harold may have been entering the Duke's service and acknowledging him as a superior. The image therefore lies at the center of the Norman interpretation of what followed. According to this view, William treated Harold with honor, freed him from captivity, included him in his household, allowed him to fight beside Norman knights, and finally accepted him as a sworn man. Harold, in return, supposedly promised loyalty, yet the political meaning of this relationship is difficult to understand. Harold was not an obscure knight in search of a patron. He was Earl of Wessex, the most powerful nobleman in England, and a subject of King Edward. Why would he willingly become the vassal of a foreign duke? The answer may be that he did not act willingly at all. Although Harold was treated with outward respect, he remained in William's territory and depended on the Duke for permission to leave. Any promise made under such conditions might have been shaped by pressure, fear, or necessity. The most famous scene of the entire Norman story comes shortly afterward. William sits on his throne while Harold stands between 2 sacred objects, his hands extended in opposite directions. Beneath the scene, the Latin inscription announces that Harold made an oath to Duke William. The artist does not explain the contents of the promise. The creators of the tapestry may have assumed that their audience already knew the Norman version of events. According to later Norman writers, Harold swore to defend William's claim to the English crown after Edward the Confessor's death. Some accounts also state that he promised to marry one of William's daughters, hand over important castles, and act as the Duke's representative in England. The oath was said to have been sworn upon holy relics, giving it enormous religious significance. In medieval Europe, a promise made before sacred remains was not merely political. Breaking it endangered a person's honor, reputation, and soul. Norman tradition later added a dramatic detail. Harold, it was claimed, did not initially realize that relics were hidden beneath the surface on which he placed his hands. Only after the oath had been spoken were the sacred objects revealed, making the promise even more binding. Whether this account is true cannot be known. The tapestry was produced after the Conquest and reflects the interests of the victors. Its purpose was not simply to record history, but to justify William's invasion. By portraying Harold as a sworn follower who later violated his promise, it transformed him from a political rival into an oath-breaker. That distinction mattered greatly. William did not want his invasion to appear as a naked seizure of power. He needed to present it as the punishment of a man who had betrayed a sacred commitment and unlawfully taken a crown that belonged to another. The oath scene supplied the moral argument his cause required. To understand its importance, one must understand the place of loyalty in medieval society. In a fragmented world where kings often lacked the power to defend every village or estate, personal bonds between lords and followers became essential. A weaker man might place himself under the protection of a stronger ruler. In return for military service, agricultural payments, or political support, the lord promised to defend the follower, his family, and his property. These relationships were confirmed through public ceremonies. Hands were joined, promises were spoken, gifts were exchanged, and sacred objects were sometimes used as witnesses. The resulting bond was regarded as serious and lasting. A vassal was expected to answer his lord's call in war, attend his court, and remain faithful against enemies. The lord, in return, was expected to protect the vassal and treat him justly. The system helped create order in a violent age. Viking fleets attacked from the north, Magyar horsemen invaded from the east, and raiders from the Mediterranean threatened the southern coasts of Europe. Local defense therefore depended heavily on networks of armed loyalty. Yet the system also created contradictions. A nobleman might hold land from several different lords and owe duties to each of them. If those lords went to war against one another, he might be forced to violate one oath in order to honor another. Harold's position was even more complicated. As an English earl, he already owed loyalty to King Edward, the English crown, and the political community of the kingdom. Even if he had sworn something to William, he could later argue that his first duty remained with England. This would become especially important after Edward's death, when the English council known as the Witan selected Harold as king. To the English, his acceptance of the crown could be presented as an act of national duty. To the Normans, it was the final proof of betrayal. The same event could therefore be understood in two completely different ways. Harold may have seen the oath in Normandy as a promise extracted while he was effectively a captive. William saw it as a binding commitment freely made before God. Harold may have believed that the decision of the English nobles outweighed any private promise made abroad. William believed that no council could release Harold from a sacred obligation. The dispute was not simply about who had the stronger blood connection to Edward, it was also a struggle over honor, legitimacy, law, and memory. After the ceremony, Harold was finally allowed to return to England. For a time, the crisis remained hidden beneath the surface. Edward was still alive, Harold continued to serve the English crown, and William remained across the Channel. Yet the political relationship between the two men had changed forever. William believed he had gained a supporter and future vassal. Harold may have believed he had escaped a dangerous situation by making whatever promises were necessary. Neither interpretation could remain untested for long. Less than a year after his return, Harold faced a serious crisis within his own family. In Northumbria, rebellion erupted against his brother Tostig, whose harsh rule had made him deeply unpopular among the northern nobility. The revolt forced Harold to travel north and confront an impossible decision. He could support his brother and risk a wider civil war, or abandon Tostig and preserve peace within the kingdom. Harold chose England over family. He accepted the rebels' demands, removed Tostig from power, and recognized another earl in his place. Tostig fled into exile, furious at what he regarded as a personal betrayal. This family conflict would have disastrous consequences. Tostig would not disappear quietly. Bitter, ambitious, and determined to recover what he had lost, he began searching for foreign allies. His actions would eventually bring another claimant into the struggle for the English crown. By the beginning of 1066, the kingdom was approaching catastrophe from several directions at once. An aging king was nearing death without an heir. Harold stood at the center of English government. William prepared to enforce the promise he believed had been made to him. Tostig sought revenge against his own brother. And in Norway, Harald Hardrada watched England with the confidence of a warrior who had never been afraid to gamble everything on a single campaign. The oath shown in the Bayeux Tapestry had not ended the dispute. It had only given the coming war its most powerful justification. Tostig Godwinson had grown up in one of the most powerful families in England. Like his elder brother Harold, he had earned a reputation for courage in battle, and the two brothers had once fought side by side against the Welsh. Yet beneath their shared military ability lay a deep difference in character. Harold was usually patient, calculating, and politically cautious. Tostig was far more impulsive. He could be brave and decisive, but he was also proud, quick-tempered, and unwilling to tolerate opposition. Those qualities would eventually destroy his position in England and help plunge the kingdom into war. In 1055, Tostig was appointed Earl of Northumbria, one of the most difficult regions in the country to govern. Northumbria stretched across the northern frontier from the English Midlands toward the Scottish border. It was a land shaped by violence, distance, and cultural division. Many of its inhabitants descended from Scandinavian settlers, and Danish legal customs remained deeply rooted in local society. Even generations after the Viking conquests, the region retained a distinctive identity. Some still referred to parts of northern England as the Danelaw, recalling the period when Scandinavian rulers and laws had dominated much of the territory. Life in Northumbria demanded toughness. The population had long endured raids, border warfare, and political uncertainty. Scottish armies could descend from the north, while Scandinavian ships still threatened the coast. The region's nobles were accustomed to considerable independence and did not easily accept interference from distant rulers in the south. Tostig failed to understand this political reality. Rather than adapting to the traditions of the north, he attempted to impose stronger control. He favored the authority of the central government and tried to reduce the influence of Danish legal customs. To some at the royal court, this may have appeared to be a sensible step toward creating a more unified kingdom. To many Northumbrians, however, it looked like an attack on their identity and ancient rights. Tostig also developed a reputation for severity. His enemies accused him of heavy taxation, arbitrary punishment, and the murder of political rivals. Whether every charge was justified is difficult to determine, but by 1065 resentment against him had reached a dangerous level. The revolt began among the northern nobles and quickly spread. Rebels seized control of York, killed several of Tostig's supporters, and declared that they would no longer accept him as their earl. They chose Morcar, a member of another powerful aristocratic family, to replace him. Tostig turned to King Edward for help. The king had always treated him with favor and initially regarded the rebellion as an attack on royal authority. Edward wished to punish the rebels and restore Tostig by force, but such a decision risked igniting a civil war at the worst possible moment. The man sent to investigate the crisis was Harold Godwinson. The mission placed Harold in an agonizing position. Tostig was his brother, and family loyalty mattered greatly in 11th century politics. Yet Harold was also the most important servant of the English crown and had a duty to preserve the peace of the kingdom. After meeting the northern rebels and examining their complaints, Harold reached a painful conclusion. Tostig had become impossible to defend. The revolt was too widespread to be crushed without enormous bloodshed. The Northumbrians were united against their earl, and forcing them to accept him again might have shattered England into open conflict. Harold therefore advised Edward to negotiate. The king reluctantly accepted the rebels' terms. Tostig was removed from office, the insurgents were pardoned, and Morcar was recognized as the new Earl of Northumbria. For Tostig, the decision was an unforgivable betrayal. He believed Harold had sacrificed him to strengthen his own political position. Instead of defending his brother before the king, Harold had sided with the rebels who had driven him from power. Tostig's anger soon turned into a consuming desire for revenge. He left England with his wife, Judith, and their household, seeking refuge in Flanders. Judith's half-brother, Count Baldwin, received them and provided protection. From exile, Tostig began searching for soldiers, ships, and allies who might help him recover what he had lost. His departure appeared to solve the Northumbrian crisis. In reality, it had created a far greater danger. While Tostig plotted overseas, King Edward's health deteriorated. The year 1065 drew to a close beneath a growing atmosphere of uncertainty. Edward had ruled England for more than 2 decades, but he had never produced a child. His death would leave the kingdom without an obvious hereditary successor. On December 28th, the great church at Westminster was consecrated. The construction of the abbey had been one of Edward's most cherished projects. Inspired by religious architecture he had known in Normandy, the building represented both his devotion and his desire to leave behind a lasting monument. Yet the king was too ill to attend its dedication. As Edward weakened, the leading nobles and churchmen gathered near the royal court. They understood that the succession could no longer be postponed. The future of England might depend upon what happened during the king's final hours. Edward's reign had been dominated by the extraordinary rise of the Godwin family. Earl Godwin had begun his career under the Danish king Canute and had gradually become the most powerful nobleman in England. His origins were uncertain, and aristocratic rivals often mocked him as a man of humble birth. Yet through political skill, wealth, and determination, he had placed his family at the center of the kingdom. His daughter Edith had married King Edward. His sons received some of the richest earldoms in England. Harold controlled Wessex, Tostig had ruled Northumbria, Gurth held East Anglia, and Leofwine possessed lands across the southeastern Midlands. The family's success was remarkable, but it also created suspicion. Other nobles feared that the Godwins had gained so much power that the king himself could barely govern without them. Edward had once attempted to break their influence. In 1051, Godwin and his children were driven into exile after a major political confrontation. Yet they returned the following year with enough military support to force the king to restore their lands and titles. Godwin died in 1053, but his family remained dominant. Harold inherited both his father's position and his political responsibilities. By the final years of Edward's reign, he had become the practical leader of the kingdom. On January 4, 1066, Edward lay close to death. Harold was present beside him, together with Archbishop Stigand of Canterbury and other members of the royal household. The dying king reportedly spoke of visions and disasters that would soon fall upon England. Some dismissed his words as the confusion of a sick man. Others later interpreted them as prophecy. Eventually, the conversation turned to the only question that mattered: who would rule after Edward? According to English tradition, Edward stretched out his hand toward Harold and entrusted the kingdom to him. The two men were not brothers by blood, but Harold was the brother of Queen Edith and therefore Edward's brother-in-law. More importantly, he had served as the king's closest political and military supporter for many years. Edward died on January 5, 1066. News of his death spread quickly, but grief could not be allowed to delay political action. England needed a king immediately. A long vacancy would invite rebellion, invasion, and rival claims. Yet Edward's final words alone could not determine the succession. Unlike several continental kingdoms, England did not follow an unbreakable system in which the crown passed automatically from father to son. Anglo-Saxon kingship preserved older Germanic traditions. Royal blood was important, but so were political support, military ability, and the approval of the kingdom's leading nobles. That approval came through the Witan, the Council of Bishops, Earls, and powerful landowners. The Witan possessed the authority to recognize a new monarch. It did not elect kings in the modern sense, but its support transformed a claimant into a legitimate ruler. A dying king might recommend a successor, yet the council still had to accept him. The surviving accounts do not reveal how much debate took place after Edward's death. The meeting may have been brief. Some nobles may have objected, especially those from the north who resented Harold's role in Tostig's removal. Others may have believed that a different member of the ancient royal house should be chosen. Nevertheless, the practical arguments in Harold's favor were overwhelming. He was already the strongest noble in England. He had years of administrative experience, commanded powerful military forces, and possessed the support of much of the aristocracy. At a moment of extreme danger, England needed a ruler who could act immediately. By the end of the day, the Witan had accepted him. Edward was buried at Westminster on January 6th. The abbey in which he was laid to rest had been consecrated only days earlier. His funeral marked the end of the restored House of Wessex, the dynasty that traced its greatness back to Alfred. That same afternoon, Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England. The speed of the ceremony was politically necessary. A crown placed quickly upon Harold's head reduced the risk of disorder and made it more difficult for foreign rivals to intervene before the new government was established. To the English council, the matter was settled. To three other men, it had only begun. The first was William, Duke of Normandy. William based his claim on both family connection and alleged promise. Through Edward's Norman relatives, he was related to the dead king. The connection was not especially close, but in an age when royal blood carried great political weight, it could not be ignored. More importantly, William insisted that Edward had named him as heir, and that Harold had personally sworn to defend his claim. If Harold had freely made such an oath before sacred relics, William could portray his coronation as a violation of both feudal loyalty and divine law. Harold would not simply be a rival king, he would be an oathbreaker who had seized a crown promised to another man. The second threat came from Tostig. Tostig possessed no strong hereditary or constitutional claim to the throne. He did not need one. His purpose was revenge. He blamed Harold for his exile and wanted to destroy the brother who had chosen the kingdom over him. Through his marriage and foreign connections, he had access to powerful courts across northern Europe. He could seek support from Flanders, Normandy, Denmark, or Norway. Among all the men involved in the approaching conflict, Tostig was perhaps the least restrained. He was driven by wounded pride rather than careful strategy, and that made him especially dangerous. The third challenger was the most terrifying warrior of them all. Harald Sigurdsson, better known as Harald Hardrada, had ruled Norway for nearly 18 years. His name meant the hard ruler, and it suited him perfectly. Long before becoming king, Harald had lived the life of a wandering warrior. As a young man, he fled Scandinavia and traveled east into the lands of the Rus. There, he entered the service of powerful princes before continuing south to Constantinople. In the Byzantine Empire, he joined the Varangian Guard, the elite Scandinavian bodyguard of the emperor. Harald fought across the Mediterranean world, taking part in campaigns in Asia Minor, the Balkans, Sicily, and possibly the Middle East. He accumulated immense wealth, military experience, and a reputation for ruthless courage. By the time he returned to Norway and claimed the crown, he had fought in more lands than almost any ruler in Europe. Harold's claim to England came through earlier agreements among Scandinavian kings. The legal basis was complicated and weak by English standards, but legal arguments mattered little if they were supported by a large invasion fleet. If Harald Hardrada turned his attention toward England, he could unleash the full force of the Scandinavian world upon Harold's new kingdom. Thus, 4 men now stood at the center of England's fate. Harold Godwinson possessed the crown, the support of the Witan, and control of the kingdom. William of Normandy possessed an alleged promise, a blood connection, and one of the most disciplined armies in Europe. Tostig possessed hatred, foreign contacts, and an intense determination to punish his brother. Harald Hardrada possessed experience, ships, and the most feared warrior reputation in the north. Only one of them could remain standing when the struggle ended. Across the Channel, William received the news while hunting near Rouen. A messenger informed him that Edward was dead and Harold had already been crowned. According to later tradition, William immediately ended the hunt. He returned to his residence without speaking and sat alone for hours, consumed by anger and calculation. To William, Harold's coronation was not merely disappointing, it was an act of betrayal. The Duke soon emerged from his silence with a decision. He would not negotiate, he would not abandon his claim. He would gather ships, soldiers, horses, supplies, and religious support. He would cross the Channel and take England by force. Meanwhile, another sign appeared in the sky. In April 1066, an extraordinary comet became visible above England. Its bright head and long tail dominated the night, terrifying those who watched it. Medieval people did not see such events as distant astronomical phenomena. They interpreted them as messages from God, warnings of war, royal death, or the fall of kingdoms. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded that no one living had seen anything like it. Men pointed upward in fear. Some believed the comet announced disaster for the newly crowned king. Others may have taken it as proof that Edward's dark prophecy was beginning to unfold. Today, the object is known as Halley's Comet. In 1066, it seemed like an eye of fire staring down upon England. Harold had been king for only a few months, yet enemies were already gathering on opposite sides of the sea. William prepared in Normandy. Tostig searched for allies. Harald Hardrada watched from Norway. And beneath the burning comet, England waited for the invasion that everyone now feared was coming. William, Duke of Normandy, had every reason to be furious when he learned that Harold Godwinson had accepted the English crown. Whether his outrage came from genuine betrayal or careful political calculation is impossible to know. William was certainly ambitious enough to expect resistance, and he may never have truly believed that Harold would voluntarily surrender an entire kingdom simply because of a promise made years earlier. Yet the story of the broken oath offered him something far more valuable than personal revenge. It gave him a powerful justification for war. William understood that conquering England would require much more than his own determination. His Norman followers were loyal, but they were not obligated to cross the Channel for a distant campaign. An invasion would demand enormous resources, months of preparation, and the willingness of hundreds of knights to risk their lives for uncertain rewards. If William wanted their support, he first had to convince them that his cause was both lawful and righteous. The strongest argument available to him lay in the authority of the Church. William enjoyed a close relationship with Lanfranc, the brilliant prior of the Abbey of Bec and one of the most respected churchmen in Normandy. Lanfranc possessed influential connections in Rome, particularly with Pope Alexander II, who had studied at Bec years before becoming head of the Catholic Church. Through Norman envoys and respected clergy, William's case was presented before the papal court. The Duke's representatives argued that Harold had violated a sacred oath sworn before holy relics and had unlawfully seized the English throne. They also portrayed the English Church as a kingdom in need of reform, claiming that corruption, disorder, and outdated customs had weakened religious discipline. William promised that if he became king, he would restore proper ecclesiastical order and bring England more closely into line with the reforms already spreading across continental Europe. He offered something else as well. William hinted that a conquered England would recognize the Pope as its feudal overlord in spiritual matters, strengthening papal influence across the Channel. Whether he intended to fulfill every promise is another question, but politically, they were highly effective. Pope Alexander II accepted the Norman arguments. His endorsement transformed William's planned expedition. No longer could it be dismissed as the private ambition of a powerful duke. With papal approval, the invasion could now be presented as a campaign supported by the Church itself. The Pope even sent William a sacred banner, a visible sign that the enterprise carried religious legitimacy. The effect on Norman opinion was dramatic. Knights who might otherwise have hesitated now viewed the expedition as both honorable and blessed by God. William displayed the papal banner during meetings with his leading nobles, reminding them that they would not simply be fighting for land and wealth, but for what the Church itself regarded as a just cause. By the spring of 1066, preparations were fully underway. Across Normandy, forests echoed with the sound of axes as thousands of trees were felled. Carpenters shaped timber into hulls, while blacksmiths forged nails, fittings, and weapons. Shipbuilders worked relentlessly along rivers and coastal harbors, producing a fleet unlike anything Normandy had assembled before. The Bayeux Tapestry preserves remarkable scenes from this effort. Craftsmen cut enormous oak trunks, smooth heavy planks with broad tools, and assemble vessels piece by piece. Horses are prepared for transport, supplies are gathered, and every available resource is directed toward the coming expedition. While William prepared for war, the skies themselves appeared to deliver an unsettling message. During the third week of April 1066, an extraordinary comet blazed across the heavens. To modern astronomers, it is known as Halley's Comet, one of the most famous periodic comets in history. Medieval observers, however, had no understanding of orbital mechanics. They regarded unusual celestial events as warnings from God, announcing the deaths of kings, the fall of kingdoms, or the arrival of great disasters. The brilliant object remained visible for many days, shining brighter than almost any celestial phenomenon living people could remember. Its appearance caused widespread anxiety throughout England. The Bayeux Tapestry captures the moment vividly. Men point upward with alarm, while others stare silently into the sky. Their gestures reveal fear rather than curiosity. To contemporaries, the comet seemed less like an astronomical wonder than a divine announcement that extraordinary events were approaching. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle also recorded the strange visitor, emphasizing that nothing comparable had been seen for generations. History would later remember the comet because it appeared only months before one of the most important years in English history. Long before 1066, civilizations across the world had observed the same wandering light. Chinese astronomers had documented similar appearances for centuries, carefully recording its movements through the heavens. Medieval Europeans likewise remembered earlier visitations, yet each new appearance inspired fresh fears among those who witnessed it. Centuries later, the English astronomer Edmund Halley studied historical records and realized that these seemingly separate comets were actually the same celestial body returning at regular intervals. His calculations successfully predicted its return, and ever since, the comet has carried his name. In 1066, however, no one could have explained its true nature. To Harold's subjects, it looked like an omen hanging directly over England. As if the heavens themselves had announced approaching trouble, the first challenge soon appeared. Tostig Godwinson had returned. Driven by resentment and determined to punish his brother, the exiled Earl launched raids along the southern and eastern coast of England. His attacks were intended not merely to gather supplies, but to undermine Harold's authority and demonstrate that the new king could not even protect his own shores. Some coastal settlements suffered damage before English forces finally intercepted the raiders near the Thames estuary. Tostig's small fleet was defeated, and many of his followers were killed or scattered. The survivors escaped by sea, abandoning any immediate hope of restoring Tostig's position through a local uprising. Forced to withdraw once again, Tostig sailed north. He sought refuge at the court of Malcolm III of Scotland, better known as Malcolm Canmore. Scotland itself had only recently emerged from years of political violence. Malcolm was attempting to strengthen his kingdom while carefully balancing relations with his southern neighbor. Although he had little desire for open war against England, he recognized that an exiled English prince could prove useful. Malcolm welcomed Tostig warmly. The two men already knew one another from the years when Tostig governed Northumbria. Malcolm encouraged his guests' hopes of reclaiming power and may have enjoyed the uncertainty that the Godwin family now faced. A divided England was generally advantageous for Scotland, yet encouragement was not enough. Tostig wanted ships, soldiers, and a full military alliance. Malcolm, cautious by nature, proved unwilling to commit himself to such an ambitious venture. Realizing that Scotland alone could not restore him, Tostig continued his search. Instead of turning south toward Normandy, where William was assembling his invasion, he sailed east across the North Sea to Denmark. The decision reflected both courage and desperation. Denmark possessed deep historical connections with England. Only a generation earlier, Canute had ruled both kingdoms simultaneously, creating one of the greatest Scandinavian empires of the Middle Ages. If any foreign ruler might be persuaded to intervene, the Danish king seemed an obvious candidate. King Svein received Tostig courteously. Rather than dismissing him outright, he offered the exiled earl lands and status in Denmark if he chose to remain there permanently. It was a generous proposal that would have provided security and influence without further bloodshed. Tostig refused. He wanted more than safety. He wanted revenge. He urged Svein to revive Denmark's old claims to England, arguing that Scandinavian influence there remained strong and that Harold's position was vulnerable. Svein was unconvinced. Unlike his famous uncle Canute, he regarded himself as a more cautious ruler. Conquering England demanded enormous resources, uncertain logistics, and the risk of catastrophic defeat. Denmark already faced challenges closer to home, particularly from Norway. According to later tradition, Svein reminded Tostig that Canute's achievements belonged to an exceptional man whose successes could not easily be repeated. Rather than chasing impossible dreams, he preferred governing the kingdom he already possessed. To Tostig, this sounded like cowardice. He left Denmark disappointed but not defeated. There remained one final ruler capable of changing England's destiny. That ruler was Harald Hardrada of Norway. By 1066, Harold had become one of the most legendary warriors in Europe. For more than 3 decades, he had fought on battlefields stretching from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean. His experiences with the Varangian Guard in Constantinople had earned him wealth, fame, and unmatched military confidence. When Tostig arrived at his court, he proposed a partnership. Harold would provide the army, the fleet, and the military strength. Tostig would contribute his knowledge of England, his political connections, and his claim to Northumbria. Together they could overthrow Harold Godwinson and divide the rewards. At first, Harold hesitated. His advisors pointed out the obvious danger. Norway would bear nearly all the expense and fighting, while Tostig, because of his English birth, might ultimately seize control of the conquered kingdom. Tostig answered with a carefully crafted argument. For years, Harold had attempted to dominate Denmark without lasting success. England, Tostig insisted, represented a far richer and more attainable prize. Harold's recent accession, internal political divisions, and the resentment still lingering in northern England made the kingdom appear vulnerable. Harold considered the proposal carefully. Finally, he agreed. Messengers spread throughout Norway, ordering warriors to prepare for one of the greatest expeditions of Harold's reign. Ships were assembled, supplies collected, and experienced fighters summoned from across the kingdom. Not everyone believed success was certain. Some remembered Harold's extraordinary military career and argued that no challenge lay beyond his abilities. Others warned that England possessed formidable defenders, especially the king's professional household troops, whose discipline and skill were widely admired. Even supporters admitted that the campaign would test Norway's greatest warrior as never before. Meanwhile, Harold Godwinson possessed one enormous advantage. England was an island. Any invading army had to cross the sea, and Harold inherited one of the strongest naval traditions in northern Europe. The foundations of the English fleet stretched back to Alfred the Great, who had realized centuries earlier that Viking attacks were best defeated before enemy warriors ever reached land. By 1066, Harold commanded a fleet large enough to patrol the southern coastline and monitor activity across the Channel. Although it could not guarantee complete security against every Scandinavian armada, it presented a serious obstacle to any invasion. William therefore faced difficulties beyond raising an army. Normandy's ancestors had once been Vikings, famous for their mastery of ships and the sea. Yet generations of settled life in France had transformed them into primarily land-based warriors. Their greatest military experience now lay in cavalry charges and castle warfare rather than naval expeditions. Before they could conquer England, they first had to rediscover the maritime skills of their Scandinavian forefathers. Shipyards worked day and night. The vessels under construction were not enormous warships. Most were relatively compact transports capable of carrying a dozen soldiers along with weapons, provisions, and perhaps one or two horses. Hundreds would be required to move William's invasion force across the Channel in a single coordinated operation. As summer approached, 3 separate storms were gathering around England. William prepared in Normandy with papal approval and an expanding fleet. Harald Hardrada assembled Norway's greatest warriors, and Tostig, driven by vengeance, had finally found the ally he had been searching for. Harold Godwinson stood at the center of these converging threats, knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon, 3 enemies were preparing to challenge everything he had fought to protect. While William struggled to assemble an invasion fleet across the Channel, Harold Godwinson prepared England for the attack he believed was coming from the south. The English king understood that defeating an invasion required more than courage. He needed a military system capable of responding quickly to whatever force eventually landed on English soil. Fortunately, England possessed several layers of defense, each designed for a different purpose. At the center of Harold's army stood the housecarls. These professional warriors formed the elite of the English military. Originally introduced during the reign of Canute, the housecarls had evolved into the king's permanent fighting force. Unlike ordinary levies, they trained continuously and devoted their lives to warfare. Although they often rode horses to move rapidly across the countryside, they usually dismounted before battle. Their true strength lay in fighting shoulder to shoulder as disciplined infantry. Each man carried a massive Danish axe capable of smashing shields, helmets, and armor with terrifying force. The weapon demanded great strength, but in experienced hands it became one of the deadliest arms in medieval Europe. Few enemies willingly faced a line of determined housecarls. Their reputation spread far beyond England. Contemporary observers regarded them as among the finest royal bodyguards anywhere in northern Europe. Had they ever met the Varangian Guard of Constantinople on equal ground, it would have been one of the most extraordinary clashes of professional warriors the medieval world could have witnessed. Behind the king's household troops came the Fyrd. The Fyrd was England's organized militia, summoned whenever the kingdom faced serious danger. Every shire contributed fighting men under the leadership of local earls and nobles. Unlike the housecarls, these soldiers were not professionals. They were farmers, craftsmen, and landowners who temporarily exchanged their ordinary lives for military service. When properly supplied with food, the Fyrd could remain in the field for extended periods. Yet, its effectiveness remained uncertain. England had enjoyed relative stability for many years, and many of these men had little practical experience of large-scale warfare. Harold possessed one final source of manpower. In moments of national emergency, virtually every able-bodied free man could be called upon to defend the kingdom. Such levies produced impressive numbers, but they also created enormous difficulties. Most of these men had farms, families, and livestock waiting for them at home. They could not remain under arms indefinitely, and many expected to return to their villages each evening whenever circumstances allowed. Although cumbersome, this system offered an important advantage to defenders. Invading armies had to survive far from home, while English farmers fought close to their own fields, families, and supplies. Soon after Tostig's coastal raids, Harold ordered the mobilization of the Fyrd. Men arrived from every corner of southern England and occupied defensive positions along the shores of Wessex and Sussex. Watchposts were strengthened, coastal settlements remained alert, and scouts searched constantly for signs of Norman sails approaching from across the Channel. The timing favored Harold. Spring planting had already been completed, while the autumn harvest still lay weeks away. Farmers could therefore spend much of the summer serving the king without immediately endangering the year's food supply. So Harold waited. Day after day, his army remained on the southern coast, expecting William to appear at any moment. Across the Channel, William waited as well. His army was ready, his ships were assembled, and his knights stood prepared for war. Yet one obstacle remained beyond human control: the wind. Norman transport vessels depended heavily upon favorable weather. They could not simply sail directly against strong winds blowing from the north. Until conditions changed, William's magnificent invasion force remained trapped on the French coast. Days became weeks. Neither commander realized that the greatest threat it was gathering far to the north. During the early summer of 1066, Harald Hardrada began assembling the greatest Norwegian expedition of his reign. Messengers traveled throughout Norway, ordering experienced warriors to gather at Solund, an island near the western coast. Harald's fame alone attracted enormous numbers of volunteers. His victories across Europe had made him a legendary figure among Scandinavian fighters, and thousands answered his summons. By the end of the summer, a powerful Viking army stood ready. Yet Harald himself delayed his departure. Before joining the fleet, he remained in Trondheim, where one final journey awaited him. Harold visited the shrine of his older half-brother, Olaf II. 36 years earlier, the two brothers had fought together at the Battle of Stiklestad. Olaf had been killed, while the 15-year-old Harold escaped into exile. That defeat had sent the young prince eastward, beginning the remarkable adventures that eventually carried him to Russia, Constantinople, Sicily, and back again to Norway. Now, standing before Olaf's tomb, Harold prepared for one last campaign. Olaf had become Norway's first Christian king and was later honored as a saint. Harold, however, retained many beliefs inherited from older Scandinavian traditions. According to later accounts, he performed rituals that reflected those ancient customs rather than orthodox Christian practice. He clipped his fingernails, offered symbolic gifts before the shrine, and completed ceremonies that likely blended pagan customs with Christian reverence. Before leaving, he threw the key to the sanctuary into a nearby river, almost as though sealing the chapter of his past before beginning the greatest gamble of his life. Then he departed for Solund. Harold did not travel alone. His wife Elizabeth, daughter of the Prince of Novgorod, accompanied him together with their daughters. His younger son Olaf also joined the expedition, while his elder son Magnus remained behind in Norway to govern the kingdom during his father's absence. It was a practical decision. Should the invasion fail, Norway would still possess an undisputed ruler. Harold intended to conquer England, but he also prepared for the possibility that he might never return. Toward the end of August, the fleet finally sailed. The Norwegian ships first reached the Shetland Islands before continuing to the Orkneys, where additional warriors, provisions, and ships joined the expedition. Every stop strengthened Harold's already formidable force. By the time the Armada approached England, roughly 240 ships crossed the North Sea together. Europe had not witnessed a Viking expedition of such magnitude for generations. To many observers, it seemed as though the great age of Scandinavian conquest had suddenly returned. Exactly when Tostig joined Harold remains uncertain. Some accounts suggest he accompanied the Norwegian king from an early stage. Others indicate that he continued gathering supporters elsewhere before eventually meeting the invasion fleet. Whatever the exact sequence of events, there was never any doubt about command. Harald Hardrada led the expedition. Tostig served as his English ally and advisor. The voyage from Norway presented little difficulty for experienced Scandinavian sailors. Generations of Vikings had mastered these northern waters, navigating between Norway, the islands of Scotland, and the English coast with remarkable confidence. The English, by contrast, rarely ventured so far north. Harold therefore approached England from a direction few expected. While Harold Godwinson concentrated nearly all his attention on Normandy, the Norwegian fleet descended upon Yorkshire almost completely unnoticed. The surprise was total. England's strongest troops, including the housecarls and much of the Fyrd, remained hundreds of miles away in the south, patiently awaiting William's invasion. The north stood dangerously exposed. Harold also traveled with an unusually complex family. Elizabeth, his senior wife and the daughter of the ruler of Novgorod, had shared much of his remarkable career abroad. She had borne him two daughters, Maria and Ingigerd, both of whom accompanied the expedition. Harold hoped they might strengthen political alliances with influential nobles in the Northern Islands if circumstances required. Years later, Harold had taken a second wife, Thora, a Norwegian noblewoman who gave him two sons, Magnus and Olaf. Although Elizabeth remained his principal queen, Harold's children from both marriages would later play important roles after his death. At last, in September 1066, England learned that the long-feared invasion had arrived. On September 12th, Norwegian ships appeared before Scarborough on England's northeastern coast. The town resisted stubbornly. Harold answered with characteristic brutality. Scarborough was stormed, looted, and burned. Flames rose high above the coastline, sending smoke visible for miles across Yorkshire. The destruction served two purposes. It punished resistance and spread fear throughout northern England. Almost immediately, messengers began carrying news southward. Horsemen raced from settlement to settlement, warning that a massive Scandinavian fleet had landed. Beacon fires may also have been lit, allowing word of the invasion to travel with astonishing speed across the countryside. Far away in southern England, Harold Godwinson finally received the news he had never expected. The enemy he had spent months preparing to face was not William of Normandy. It was Harald Hardrada. England now confronted a crisis unlike anything in its recent history. A powerful Norwegian king had landed with the largest Viking army in decades. Tostig had returned beside him, burning for revenge. William still waited across the channel with another invasion force ready to sail as soon as the winds changed. Harold faced an impossible decision. He could remain in the south and guard against William, allowing Harold to devastate northern England. Or he could march north to confront the Vikings, knowing that the moment he left, the Norman Duke might finally cross the sea. Whichever choice he made, one enemy would find England exposed. The Norwegian fleet continued southward before turning into the Humber estuary, one of the great waterways leading into northern England. As Harald Hardrada's ships moved inland, the invaders passed through fertile country filled with farms, settlements, and valuable land. To the Norse warriors, the landscape must have looked like a promise of everything they had crossed the sea to claim. Around September 18th, the Viking army came ashore and began marching toward York, the most important city in northern England, and second only to London in size and influence. Whoever controlled York could dominate much of the north. The defenders had little time to prepare. Earl Morcar of Northumbria and his brother Edwin, Earl of Mercia, gathered whatever forces they could and moved to block the Norwegian advance. Their army was far smaller than the full military strength of England, but Harold Godwinson and the royal housecarls were still hundreds of miles away in the south. The English and Norwegian armies met near Fulford, close to the River Derwent. The ground shaped everything that followed. Marshes, ditches, and the river narrowed the battlefield, making it difficult for either army to maneuver freely. Morcar and Edwin formed their men in a compact line and attempted to press the Norwegians against the water. At first, the English attack appeared to succeed. The weakest section of Harold's formation stood near a ditch and began to fall back under pressure. Morcar's men advanced eagerly, believing the Norwegian line was collapsing. They pushed forward along the difficult ground, breaking the shape of their own formation as they pursued. Harold had been waiting for exactly such a moment. From his position near the river, he saw the English flank stretching forward and becoming isolated. He ordered an immediate counterattack. His famous royal banner, known as Land Waster, moved to the front as the strongest Norwegian troops surged toward the exposed English line. The attack struck with devastating force. The English advance stopped almost instantly. Men were pushed backward into the marshes and toward the riverbanks. What had looked like a Norwegian retreat became a carefully exploited weakness in the English position. Morcar and Edwin tried to hold their army together, but the formation rapidly disintegrated. Some soldiers fled along the river. Others attempted to cross the wet ground and became trapped in the mud. Later, Norse accounts claimed that bodies piled so densely in the marsh that warriors could pass over them without touching the water. The image is almost certainly exaggerated, but the scale of the defeat was real. The Battle of Fulford ended in a clear Norwegian victory. Both English earls survived, despite later Scandinavian claims that Morcar had been killed. Their army, however, had been shattered. Thousands of men were dead, wounded, or scattered, and there was no organized force left in the north capable of stopping Harold's advance. York now stood exposed. Harold could have stormed the city and allowed his army to plunder it. Instead, he chose a more calculated approach. Northern England was home to communities of both Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian descent. Old Danish customs remained strong, and Harold believed he might gain more through negotiation than destruction. If the people of York accepted him peacefully, he could present himself not as a foreign raider, but as the rightful ruler of a region with deep Norse connections. Morcar and Edwin entered negotiations. They offered submission and agreed to provide hostages. In return, Harold spared York from immediate sack. The city accepted his authority, at least for the moment, and much of northern England appeared to fall into his hands almost overnight. The Norwegian army camped outside York to recover. The victory at Fulford had been impressive, but it had not been effortless. Harold's men had fought a serious battle and had certainly suffered casualties of their own. Rest was necessary, and there seemed to be no reason for haste. As far as Harold knew, the main English army was still far to the south. That assumption would prove disastrous. King Harold had spent the summer guarding the southern coast against William of Normandy. His men had remained under arms for weeks, while supplies slowly disappeared. By early September, food was running dangerously low, and the harvest season was approaching. On September 8th, Harold finally dismissed much of the fired. The decision was practical. Militia soldiers could not remain away from their farms indefinitely, especially when winter food depended on the coming harvest. William had still not sailed, and maintaining thousands of men along the coast had become impossible. Then news arrived from the north. A Norwegian fleet had landed. Scarborough had been burned. Harold Hardrada and Tostig were marching toward York. Harold was in London when he learned the scale of the danger. The situation could hardly have been worse. Much of his militia had already returned home, the northern army had been defeated, and William remained across the channel waiting for favorable winds. A cautious ruler might have remained in London. From the capital, Harold could observe both threats and wait until William or Harold made the next decisive move. He might have allowed the Norwegians to advance southward, stretching their supply lines and weakening themselves before battle. Harold was not a cautious ruler. His military reputation had been built upon speed. During earlier campaigns in Wales, he had developed a method based on rapid movement, surprise, and sudden concentration of force. Rather than advancing slowly with heavy baggage and elaborate supply preparations, Harold preferred to move hard, gather his troops near the target, and strike before the enemy understood what was happening. His housecarls made such tactics possible. They were disciplined enough to endure extreme marches and still fight effectively at the end of them. Harold trusted their loyalty, stamina, and ability to attack without lengthy preparation. When he received the news of the northern invasion, he acted almost immediately. Within hours, the king, his housecarls, and every available soldier were moving north. The march that followed became one of the most extraordinary military movements of the Middle Ages. From London to Yorkshire stretched roughly 200 miles of roads, villages, forests, and open country. Harold's men covered that distance in only a few days. Many probably traveled on horseback, even though they intended to fight on foot once they reached the enemy. No surviving chronicler recorded the details of the journey. There are no descriptions of the exhaustion, broken equipment, abandoned horses, or men struggling to keep pace. Yet the speed of the advance reveals the physical strain involved. By the late afternoon of September 24th, Harold's vanguard reached Tadcaster, a town only about 10 miles south of York. The achievement was remarkable. Even more impressive was the secrecy. Harold Hardrada had no idea that the English king had left London, crossed the country, and arrived almost within striking distance. Harold was determined to preserve that advantage. No one was allowed to leave Tadcaster during the night. Traders, messengers, and travelers were prevented from carrying news toward York. The town was effectively sealed while the remaining sections of the English army arrived. Men continued entering Tadcaster after dark. Some had fallen behind during the march. Others had joined the royal force along the road. By dawn, Harold may have assembled around 7,000 soldiers. They were exhausted. Many had traveled farther in 4 days than ordinary men covered in several weeks, yet Harold refused to give them a full day of rest. Early the next morning, the army moved again. By approximately 9 o'clock, the English were marching toward York. They passed the city without opposition. The Norwegians had not placed a strong garrison inside its walls because they believed the region was already secure. The citizens remained silent, and Harold's arrival was still concealed from the Viking camp. The English continued towards Stamford Bridge on the River Derwent. Around midday, the Norwegian army finally saw them coming. Harold and Tostig were positioned on the eastern side of the river. Other Norwegian troops remained closer to the ships at Recall, while many were scattered along the road between the fleet and the bridge. The invasion force was divided. Worse still, it was unprepared for battle. The day was unusually warm, and many Norse warriors had left their mail shirts and heavier equipment near the ships. They had expected to collect hostages and supplies from York, not to face the King of England and his full household army. Men were resting, walking casually, and moving without proper formation. Some may have been eating, drinking, or singing after their victory. Then a cloud of dust appeared in the distance. Beneath it came the flash of shields and sunlight reflecting from coats of mail. Harold stopped and called Tostig to him. At first, neither man understood what they were seeing. Tostig suggested that the approaching force might be northern Englishmen coming to submit or ask for protection. As the column drew closer, the truth became impossible to ignore. It was an army, and at its head was King Harold Godwinson. The English had achieved complete surprise. Harold Hardrada, one of the most experienced commanders alive, had been caught with his army scattered, partly unarmored, and separated from many of its supplies. An orderly retreat was no longer possible. The English were advancing too quickly, and abandoning the ground would expose the Norwegians to destruction while crossing the river or attempting to reach their ships. Harold therefore decided to fight where he stood. He began pulling his men into formation on rising ground east of the Derwent. The bridge became the key to the position. If the Norwegians could delay the English crossing, the scattered sections of their army might have enough time to regroup. Messengers were sent toward Recall, ordering the troops near the ships to hurry to the battlefield. Harold and Tostig had won northern England only days earlier. Now they faced a fresh English army that had appeared as if from nowhere. The battle at Fulford had been a triumph. The battle at Stamford Bridge would decide whether that triumph had any meaning at all. As the two armies faced one another across the River Derwent, there remained one final opportunity to avoid bloodshed. A small group of English horsemen rode forward from Harold Godwinson's lines. Their mail armor flashed beneath the daylight, and even their horses were protected. The riders stopped within speaking distance of the Norwegians and called out for Tostig. The exiled earl stepped forward. One of the English messengers announced that King Harold was still prepared to forgive his brother. Tostig could recover Northumbria and return to England in peace. According to the saga tradition, Harold was even willing to grant him a third of the kingdom rather than continue the conflict. The offer came far too late. Tostig replied bitterly that such generosity would have changed everything had it been shown before his exile. Many of the men now lying dead might still have been alive, and England would not have been facing a Norwegian invasion. Yet Tostig was no longer alone. Harald Hardrada had crossed the sea on his behalf and placed an entire kingdom's military strength behind his cause. Tostig therefore asked the obvious question: what would the English king offer Harold of Norway? The answer became one of the most famous threats in medieval history. The messenger declared that Harald would receive 7 feet of English ground, or a little more, since he was taller than most men. The meaning was unmistakable. Harald Hardrada would be given only enough soil for his grave. Tostig refused to abandon his ally. Whatever anger had once driven him into exile, he would not now save himself by betraying the Norwegian king who had accepted his cause. He sent the riders back with a final message. The English should prepare for battle. The negotiations were over. Harold ordered his army forward. The first obstacle was Stamford Bridge itself. The crossing was narrow, and the Norwegians attempted to hold it while their main force organized on the eastern bank. Later tradition tells of a single Viking warrior who stood upon the bridge and delayed the entire English advance. Armed with a massive axe, he reportedly struck down every man who approached him, defending the crossing with almost superhuman strength. The story may have grown with each retelling, but it reflects the violence of the struggle. For a time, the English could not force their way across. According to legend, one English soldier finally climbed into a small boat or floated beneath the bridge. From below, he thrust a spear upward through the wooden structure and mortally wounded the defender. With the warrior dead, the English surged across the bridge. The Norwegians had lost the barrier that might have saved them. Once Harold's men reached the eastern bank, the battle widened into a confused and brutal struggle. Carefully organized formations quickly broke apart. Warriors collided in small groups, fighting with swords, spears, axes, and shields at extremely close range. The famous English shield wall could offer only limited protection in such disorder. Normally, this kind of fighting favored the Vikings. Scandinavian warriors had built their reputation on personal combat, aggressive charges, and the ability to continue fighting when formations collapsed. At Stamford Bridge, however, almost every circumstance worked against them. Many had left their armor near the fleet. Others were scattered along the road and arrived in separate groups. Some had been drinking during what they believed would be a peaceful collection of hostages and supplies. They were not berserkers driven into a deliberate battle frenzy. They were tired, surprised, overheated men suddenly facing a disciplined royal army. The English maintained the initiative from the beginning. Harold's housecarls fought at the center of the attack, swinging their long axes with devastating force. Behind them came other English soldiers who pressed relentlessly against the Norwegian position. Harald Hardrada understood that retreat meant destruction. He fought where the struggle was fiercest, surrounded by his royal banner and household warriors. Even at 51, he remained an imposing figure, taller than most men and famous for his strength. For decades, he had survived battles across the known world. He had fought beside princes in Russia, served emperors in Constantinople, campaigned in Sicily, and returned to seize the throne of Norway. Few rulers of his generation possessed greater experience. At Stamford Bridge, that extraordinary life ended. Harold was struck down during the early afternoon. Later accounts claimed that an arrow pierced his throat, though the exact manner of his death cannot be known with certainty. The greatest Viking warrior of his age fell upon English soil. The threat delivered before the battle had become reality. Harold had been promised only enough land to bury his body, and now that was all of England he would possess. The death of the king might have ended the Norwegian resistance, but Tostig refused to surrender. He gathered the survivors around the land-waster banner and continued the fight. Harold may have offered his brother another chance to withdraw, but if such an offer was made, Tostig rejected it. There would be no reconciliation. Tostig died among the Norwegian warriors sometime after Harold's fall. The two men who had launched the invasion now lay dead on the same battlefield. By the middle of the afternoon, the Norwegian army began to collapse. Groups of warriors tried to escape toward the ships, while others fought until they were surrounded and cut down. The battle seemed decided. Then reinforcements arrived. Near Rickhall, the Norwegian troops guarding the fleet had received desperate orders to march towards Stamford Bridge. They hurried across several miles in the heat, moving so quickly that many threw aside armor and equipment along the road. Their arrival briefly revived the battle. Later, Scandinavian tradition remembered this phase as Ori's Storm, named after Eystein Ori, one of Harold's leading commanders. The newly arrived warriors launched a fierce counterattack against the exhausted English. Harold's soldiers had already marched hundreds of miles and fought for hours. The physical strain was almost unimaginable. A mail shirt alone could weigh heavily on the shoulders and body. Shields, helmets, weapons, and the enormous two-handed axes of the housecarls added to the burden. Every movement demanded strength, while the unusually warm weather made exhaustion even more dangerous. For a time, the Norwegian counterattack threatened to reverse the course of the battle. Yet the reinforcements had arrived after a forced march and lacked the organization needed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Their fury could not compensate for the loss of Harold, Tostig, and much of the main army. The English recovered and pushed forward once again. Within roughly 2 hours, the counterattack was broken. By evening, Harald Hardrada's invasion force had ceased to exist as an effective army. The battlefield was covered with dead and wounded men. The Norwegian survivors fled toward Rickhall, pursued by English soldiers, until darkness brought the killing to an end. Harold Godwinson had achieved an astonishing victory. His decision to abandon the southern coast and march north had been an enormous gamble. Had the Norwegian invasion been a diversion, or had William crossed the Channel at the same moment, England might have been lost. Instead, speed and surprise had allowed Harold to destroy one of the most powerful Viking armies ever to land in England. The cost, however, was severe. The following day was devoted to the dead. English soldiers searched the battlefield for wounded companions, gathered weapons, and buried their fallen. The Norwegian bodies were placed into enormous communal graves or piled together before burial. The slaughter was so great that later writers claimed human bones could still be seen in the area generations afterward. While his army carried out this grim work, Harold returned to York. There he met Morcar and Edwin, the two earls defeated at Fulford. The king had several reasons to treat them harshly. Only a year earlier, they had led or supported the northern rebellion that drove Tostig into exile. More recently, after their defeat, they had submitted to Harald Hardrada and accepted Norwegian authority. Harold could have accused them of disloyalty. He could have stripped them of their titles, imprisoned them, or ordered their deaths. Instead, he forgave them. Morcar and Edwin renewed their allegiance, and Harold accepted their submission. The decision was politically practical. He desperately needed the cooperation of northern England and could not afford to create new enemies immediately after such a devastating battle. Yet the gesture also revealed something important about Harold's character. He could be aggressive in war, but he was not always vindictive after victory. Whether motivated by generosity, political intelligence, or a mixture of both, he understood that England needed reconciliation more than revenge. Harold also met the surviving leaders of the Norwegian expedition. Among them was Olaf, Harald Hardrada's young son. At only about 18 years old, Olaf had accompanied the invasion, but had not shared his father's fate on the battlefield. He might reasonably have expected imprisonment or execution. Instead, Harold allowed him to depart. The young prince swore friendship and promised not to attack England again. The surviving Norwegians were permitted to return home with the bodies or possessions they could carry. The scale of the disaster could be measured by the fleet. Around 240 ships had carried Harold's army toward England. Only a few dozen were needed to take the survivors away. The Viking Age had produced countless raids and invasions, but few had ended with such complete destruction. The victory was celebrated throughout York. For the first time since becoming king, Harold had defeated one of the great rivals to his throne. Tostig was dead. Harald Hardrada was dead. The north had been secured, and the largest Scandinavian invasion in generations had been shattered. There were feasts, celebrations, and moments of relief. Harold and his exhausted men must have believed that they had passed through the greatest danger England would face that year. Then a messenger arrived from the south. The news could not have come at a worse moment. While Harold had been fighting in Yorkshire, the wind over the English Channel had finally changed. William of Normandy had sailed. His fleet had reached Sussex, Harold's own homeland, and a second invasion army was already establishing itself on English soil. The soldiers who had marched 200 miles and survived the bloodshed of Stamford Bridge now faced another impossible demand. They would have to turn south immediately. There would be no long rest, no time to recover, and no chance to replace the men lost in battle. Harold Godwinson had destroyed the last great Viking invasion of England. Now he had to race across the kingdom once more and face the army that would decide England's future. For William of Normandy, the final weeks of the summer of 1066 were a test of patience. His army was assembled, his ships had been built, horses, weapons, food, wine, and equipment were ready for transport. The invasion force waited along the Norman coast, prepared to cross the Channel at a moment's notice. Only the weather refused to cooperate. For weeks, strong winds blew from the north, making the voyage toward England impossible. William's fleet had been constructed for coastal transport rather than difficult sailing against the wind. If the ships left under the wrong conditions, they could be scattered, driven back toward France, or destroyed in open water. The Duke could do nothing but wait. Every passing day created new dangers. Supplies were being consumed, soldiers were becoming restless, and some of William's allies may have begun questioning whether the expedition would ever take place. An army gathered for too long could easily lose discipline, confidence, and purpose. Then, on September 27th, the wind changed. It began blowing from the south. The opportunity William had been waiting for had finally arrived, but it came with enormous risk. There was no guarantee that the favorable wind would continue. It might weaken or reverse direction while the fleet was still in the Channel, leaving hundreds of crowded ships exposed to the English Navy. William chose to gamble everything. Orders spread rapidly through the Norman camp. Men rushed toward the shore carrying armor, shields, spears, bows, food, barrels of wine, and every other supply needed for the invasion. The most difficult cargo consisted of the horses. Norman warfare depended heavily on mounted knights, and William could not leave his cavalry behind. Yet loading frightened animals onto small wooden vessels was a dangerous and exhausting process. The Bayeux Tapestry shows men pulling, pushing, and guiding horses onto the ships while the animals resist the unfamiliar movement beneath their feet. Some vessels were still being prepared late in the day, but William refused to delay any longer. He boarded his command ship, the Mora, which had been provided by his wife, Matilda. A lantern was raised high above the vessel so that the rest of the fleet could follow its light after darkness fell. As evening approached, the Norman ships moved out into the Channel. The crossing was filled with uncertainty. Sailing at night was hazardous even for experienced crews. Navigation relied on the stars, the coastline, and the judgment of pilots who possessed only limited instruments. The sea was rough enough to alarm the horses, whose movement threatened the balance of the crowded vessels. William's captains could not know whether the English fleet had detected them. At any moment, Harold's ships might appear from the darkness and attack the invasion force while it remained trapped at sea. When dawn arrived, William looked across the water and saw nothing. His ship appeared to be alone. For a terrifying period, no other sails could be seen. The Duke had remained on course, but that would mean little if the rest of his army had been lost, scattered, or driven back to Normandy. William reportedly ordered the ship to slow down. Food and wine were brought out while the crew waited. Eventually, lookouts spotted a few vessels on the horizon. Then more appeared behind them. Within a short time, the sea was crowded with Norman ships. The fleet had not disappeared. The slower transports had simply fallen behind during the night. Relief spread through the commanders as the armada continued toward the English coast. Although the coming campaign would forever be associated with Hastings, most of William's force first landed at Pevensey in East Sussex. The site offered a sheltered approach and avoided the heavily watched ports farther east. The landing was almost completely unopposed. By the afternoon of September 28th, William and most of his army had reached English soil, Horses were led out of the ships, weapons unloaded, and supplies carried onto the shore. The most uncertain stage of the invasion had succeeded. William had crossed the Channel with approximately 7,000 men and established a foothold in England without facing the Royal Army or Navy. The ease of the landing surprised him. He did not yet know that Harold Godwinson was in Yorkshire after destroying the Norwegian army at Stamford Bridge. William knew that Tostig had been searching for allies, but he had no reliable knowledge of the invasion in the north or the extraordinary march Harold had undertaken. The absence of resistance suggested that something unusual had happened. William could not afford to assume that the English army was far away. He immediately began securing the coast. Norman troops constructed defensive positions using materials brought across the Channel. Wooden fortifications could be raised quickly, protecting the fleet and providing a secure base in case Harold appeared suddenly. Some of the army remained near Pevensey, while other forces moved toward Hastings, which offered a stronger position and easier access to the surrounding countryside. William also sent men out to gather food. The resulting raids were brutal. Norman soldiers entered farms and villages, seized livestock, took grain, and burned buildings. The Bayeux Tapestry preserves one of the most disturbing images of the campaign: a woman and child leaving their home while soldiers set fire to the roof behind them. The scene is small, but its meaning is powerful. The invasion was not simply a contest between kings and armies. Ordinary families living in Sussex were the first to experience its violence. The pillaging may not have been necessary for survival. William's fleet had carried large quantities of food and drink. The destruction was therefore probably deliberate. Sussex had once formed the heart of Harold's earldom. By burning farms and attacking local communities, William was challenging the English king directly. He was forcing Harold to choose between waiting patiently and watching his own land suffer. The violence also sent a broader message. Resistance would bring devastation. Submission might bring safety. For 2 days, William remained uncertain about Harold's position. He expected scouts, ships, or an English army to appear, but none came. Without knowing it, the Duke was benefiting from events hundreds of miles away. Harold Hardrada's invasion had drawn Harold and his strongest troops to the north. The two foreign attacks had not been coordinated, yet their timing placed England under almost unbearable pressure. In York, Harold finally learned that William had landed. The exact moment the news reached him is uncertain. Coastal beacon fires may have carried the first warning northward, while mounted messengers provided confirmation. The king had barely completed one of the most exhausting military campaigns of the age when he discovered that a second enemy had entered his own territory. There was no time to celebrate the victory at Stamford Bridge. Harold acted with the same speed he had shown before. Within a day, the king and his surviving housecarls were riding south toward London. The return journey was almost certainly slower than the march north. Many of the men were wounded. Others were exhausted from battle, travel, and lack of sleep. Some had lost equipment or horses during the campaign. Even so, they covered the distance with remarkable speed. Harold reached London on October 5th. There, for the first time in days, he received encouraging news. William had not advanced far inland. The Norman army remained concentrated between Pevensey and Hastings, strengthening its position and waiting for the English response. Harold now had an opportunity to gather a larger army. For the next several days, messengers traveled through the surrounding shires, calling men to royal service. Militia units assembled around London, while surviving housecarls recovered as best they could. Harold spent approximately 5 days rebuilding his forces. By October 10th, he believed he had gathered enough men to move south. Not everyone agreed. His younger brother Gurth urged him to remain in London. Gurth's argument was both practical and politically intelligent. William had landed, but he had not yet conquered England. The Norman army was operating in hostile territory, far from its own supplies and surrounded by a population unlikely to support it. Winter was approaching. Harold could have allowed the Normans to remain in Sussex while additional English forces assembled. Every day would strengthen the defenders and increase the pressure on William. Gurth also warned against risking the king personally. Harold had sworn an oath to William, or at least William claimed that he had. Gurth therefore suggested that another commander should lead the English army. If Gurth defeated the Normans, England would be saved. If he lost, Harold would still live and could raise another force. The survival of the king was inseparable from the survival of the kingdom. The advice was sensible. Harold rejected it. His entire military career had been built on speed, surprise, and aggressive action. He had just defeated one of the greatest warriors in Europe by moving faster than anyone thought possible. The victory at Stamford Bridge must have strengthened his belief that boldness would succeed again. He also could not tolerate William's presence in Sussex. The Normans were destroying lands Harold had governed for years. Every burned village was a personal insult and a political challenge. Harold decided to march. In hindsight, the choice appears dangerous. Had he waited another week or two, his army might have doubled in size. Reinforcements from northern and western England could have reached London. The soldiers who fought at Stamford Bridge would have gained more time to recover. Instead, Harold left with fewer than 7,000 men. Many were experienced warriors, but a significant number were still exhausted or injured from the northern campaign. The distance from London to Hastings was approximately 70 miles. Harold's army began moving south on the evening of October 11th. Orders were sent for regional forces to gather at a designated meeting point near an ancient apple tree on Senlac Ridge. The English may have traveled in separate groups before assembling near the hill. This allowed local troops to join the army without forcing the entire force to remain together during the march. The plan resembled the strategy used against Harold Hardrada. Harold intended to concentrate his men close to the enemy, advance rapidly, and attack before William had time to organize. By the evening of October 13th, the English army had gathered on Senlac Ridge. Harold raised his royal standard, the Dragon of Wessex, marking the center of his position. His brothers Gurth and Leofwine stood beside him, each commanding sections of the army. The king had chosen the ground carefully. The ridge formed a natural barrier across the road, leading inland from Hastings. William could not advance toward London without confronting the English army. The land also favored Harold's infantry. The Normans would have to attack uphill, while the English could form a defensive line along the crest. The slopes and surrounding terrain made it difficult for William's cavalry to move around the position. Harold knew Sussex well. These were familiar roads, fields, forests, and hills. William and his commanders were operating in unknown territory. The English king may have gone to sleep that night believing he had achieved another surprise. Only a few miles away, however, Norman scouts carried news of the English arrival to William. The Duke responded immediately. Whether the warning reached him late on October 13th or during the early hours of the following morning is uncertain. What mattered was that William did not allow himself to be trapped. His army was ordered to prepare for battle. Knights armed themselves, archers gathered their bows, infantry formed into units, and horses were saddled before sunrise. William had recognized Harold's strategy. The English king wanted to attack suddenly, as he had done at Stamford Bridge. William refused to give him the opportunity. At dawn, the Norman army began moving towards Senlac Ridge. Harold had finally encountered an opponent who matched his aggression. Both commanders believed that hesitation would bring defeat. Both wanted to strike first. And on the morning of October 14th, 1066, the two armies began taking their positions for the battle that would transform England forever. When dawn broke on October 14th, 1066, two armies stood facing one another across Senlac Ridge. Neither commander had a clear numerical advantage. Each force probably numbered just under 7,000 men, yet the similarities ended there. The two armies represented very different traditions of warfare, and before the day was over, those differences would determine the fate of England. William possessed the more versatile army. His force combined infantry, cavalry, and large numbers of archers into a coordinated fighting machine. The Norman knights were experienced horsemen who had spent years perfecting mounted warfare on the battlefields of France. Their cavalry was among the finest in Europe. The English army relied on something entirely different. Harold's greatest strength lay in disciplined infantry. At the center stood the housecarls, veterans armed with massive two-handed axes, capable of splitting shields, helmets, and armor with terrifying force. Around them gathered the Fyrd, local militia whose courage would now be tested against the finest cavalry on the continent. Most important of all was the shield wall. The English formed shoulder to shoulder, each shield overlapping the next to create a living barrier of wood, iron, and determined men. Spears projected through the gaps while axes waited behind them. It was an ancient method of fighting that demanded discipline above all else. If every man held his position, the formation became extraordinarily difficult to break. Harold immediately recognized the danger before him. The rapid march south had allowed him to surprise William, but it had also left him with an army that was smaller, exhausted, and less flexible than the Norman force. Charging downhill against mounted knights would almost certainly end in disaster. Only one option remained. The English would stay where they stood. Senlac Ridge offered exactly the kind of ground Harold needed. The Normans would have to attack uphill, slowing both horses and infantry before they reached the English line. Harold placed himself at the center beneath the Royal Dragon of Wessex. His brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, commanded the flanks. Together, they waited for the assault. There would be no negotiations, no final exchange of messages. Both armies understood that England's future would be decided by force alone. Before the attack began, William addressed his soldiers. He reminded them why they had crossed the sea, describing the campaign as both a rightful claim to the English crown and a holy mission supported by the Pope. They had endured dangerous weather, an uncertain landing, and weeks of preparation. Retreat was no longer an option. If they failed here, there would be no safe return to Normandy. They stood deep inside hostile territory, surrounded by people whose homes they had burned and whose villages they had plundered. Victory or destruction. Those were the only possibilities. Harold gave no dramatic speech. He hardly needed one. His men had already marched across England, defeated Harold Hardrada, and marched all the way back again. They understood exactly what was at stake. The question was no longer whether they possessed courage. The question was whether they could endure everything William intended to throw against them. The battle opened during the morning, probably around 9 o'clock. Before the main armies collided, an unusual figure rode forward from the Norman ranks. According to later chroniclers, a knight and minstrel named Taillefer asked permission to strike the first blow. Singing heroic songs about Charlemagne and Roland, he galloped toward the English line, tossing his sword into the air and catching it repeatedly as though performing before an audience. Then the performance ended. Taillefer lowered his lance and charged. He is said to have killed one English warrior with his spear, another with his sword, before being surrounded and cut down himself. Whether every detail is true or embellished by later storytellers, the episode symbolized the confidence with which the Normans entered the battle. The first assault soon followed. Norman infantry climbed the slope toward the English position, while archers attempted to soften the defenders from a distance. Missiles flew in both directions. English soldiers answered arrows with stones, javelins, and whatever weapons they could hurl downhill. Some Norman infantrymen never reached the crest before being struck down. Those who did encountered something few had ever faced: the shield wall. The impact was devastating. The tightly packed English line absorbed the attack without breaking. Norman swords crashed against overlapping shields, while long Danish axes swept outward with terrible force. Men and horses alike fell beneath the heavy blows. Unable to break through, the attackers began falling back. The first major assault had failed. The English position remained completely intact. William quickly changed tactics. If infantry alone could not shatter the shield wall, perhaps cavalry could. He ordered the mounted knights forward. One of the greatest cavalry forces in Western Europe now climbed the slopes of Senlac Ridge. Horses thundered uphill while lances lowered toward the waiting English. The result disappointed the Normans once again. The combination of steep ground, disciplined infantry, and enormous two-handed axes proved remarkably effective. Horses lost momentum before reaching the crest. Riders who came too close were dragged from their saddles or struck down by crushing axe blows. Norman knights attacked repeatedly. Again and again they were thrown back. Every type of weapon had now been tested. Arrows had failed to open the English line. Infantry had failed. Cavalry had failed. The Dragon of Wessex still flew proudly above the ridge. Then the battle nearly turned into disaster for William. As Norman units withdrew down the slope after another unsuccessful attack, some English soldiers believed the enemy was finally collapsing. Ignoring Harold's orders, or perhaps simply carried away by excitement, they abandoned the safety of the shield wall and rushed downhill in pursuit. It was the first serious mistake of the day. The English formation, which had remained solid for hours, suddenly developed dangerous gaps. At almost the same moment, panic spread among parts of the Norman army. A rumor raced through the ranks claiming that William had been killed. The consequences could have been catastrophic. William alone held together an army drawn from Normandy, Brittany, Flanders, and other regions of France. There was no obvious replacement capable of leading the invasion. The Duke reacted instantly. He rode through his own retreating soldiers, removed his helmet, and revealed his face to everyone around him. "I am still alive." The message spread almost immediately. The retreat stopped. Confidence returned. William saw another opportunity as well. The English who had charged downhill were now isolated from the main shield wall. Norman cavalry wheeled around and attacked them from several directions at once. The pursuers had exchanged a nearly impregnable defensive position for open ground. Most never returned. The destruction of these isolated groups transformed the battle. Until that moment, the English had enjoyed almost uninterrupted success. Now they had suffered heavy losses that could not easily be replaced. The psychological effect mattered as much as the casualties. For the first time, William sensed that victory might still be possible. By midday, both armies were exhausted. Men leaned on shields and weapons whenever brief pauses allowed them to recover their breath. Mail armor trapped heat despite the cool autumn weather, while hours of continuous fighting drained even the strongest warriors. Yet neither commander could stop. William launched another series of attacks early in the afternoon. Once again, infantry advanced. Once again, cavalry charged. Archers continued firing into the English ranks. The shield wall still held. Every assault weakened it slightly, but the English line refused to collapse. Later, medieval writers claimed that the Normans now began using feigned retreats. According to this tradition, small groups of cavalry deliberately pretended to flee, tempting English soldiers into pursuit before suddenly turning and destroying them. Whether these withdrawals were carefully planned or simply fortunate reactions to battlefield confusion remains one of the great debates surrounding Hastings. Some historians argue that such maneuvers were entirely possible when carried out by relatively small units rather than the whole army at once. Others believe later chroniclers transformed accidental retreats into clever tactical innovations. Whatever actually occurred, one fact is beyond dispute. As the afternoon continued, more and more English defenders left the safety of the shield wall, creating weaknesses that had not existed earlier in the day. William continued adapting. Then he found the solution he had been searching for. Throughout the battle, Norman archers had fired directly toward the English line. Most arrows struck shields or passed harmlessly overhead. Now the situation had changed. The shield wall had thinned. Gaps had appeared. William ordered his archers to alter their aim. Instead of shooting directly at the defenders, they began sending arrows high into the air. The missiles climbed above the battlefield before falling almost vertically onto the English position. The effect was immediate. Shields designed to protect against attacks from the front offered little defense against arrows dropping from above. Men instinctively raised their shields over their heads, exposing their bodies to attacks from infantry and cavalry. Others were struck before they could react. Helmets were pierced, faces were wounded, arms and legs were hit. Every casualty created another opening in the already weakened line. The shield wall, which had resisted every assault since morning, now stood dangerously close to breaking. For nearly the entire day, England had endured. Now, as evening slowly approached, the balance of the battle was finally beginning to shift. By late afternoon, William recognized that the battle had reached its decisive moment. The Norman assaults had battered the English line for hours. Archers had weakened the shield wall, cavalry had repeatedly tested its strength, and infantry had fought relentlessly against the defenders on Senlac Ridge. The English still held the high ground, but the wall of shields that had resisted every attack since morning was no longer the solid barrier it had once been. William decided to commit everything. No reserves would remain behind. Infantry, cavalry, and archers advanced together in one final effort to break the English position once and for all. The attack climbed the slope with greater momentum than any that had come before. This time, the defenders could not answer with the same strength. Hours of fighting had reduced their numbers. Many experienced housecarls already lay dead or wounded, while gaps had appeared throughout the once unbroken shield wall. The English still resisted fiercely, but the line had become thinner, slower, and more vulnerable than it had been during the morning. The fighting at the crest of Senlac quickly descended into chaos. Order dissolved as small groups of warriors clashed with swords, axes, spears, and shields at close range. Commands became difficult to hear above the noise of battle. Individual courage replaced organized formations as both armies struggled for control of the ridge. Exactly what happened during those final moments remains one of the greatest mysteries in medieval history. No surviving source provides a complete or fully convincing account. The Bayeux Tapestry offers dramatic scenes but leaves many questions unanswered. Later chroniclers disagree over essential details, especially concerning the death of King Harold. One tradition claims that an arrow struck Harold in the eye before Norman knights reached him. Another suggests that he continued fighting after being wounded and was finally cut down in hand-to-hand combat by Norman soldiers. Some historians believe both stories preserve part of the truth, that Harold may first have been wounded by an arrow before being overwhelmed during the final fighting. The evidence is simply too uncertain to reach a definite conclusion. What is certain is the outcome. As daylight began fading, the English position finally collapsed. Harold Godwinson was dead. His brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, also fell on the battlefield. Around them lay thousands of English soldiers who had marched from London, defeated Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge, and then raced south again to defend their kingdom. Without the king, organized resistance disappeared almost immediately. Groups of surviving English soldiers retreated into the forests and darkness surrounding Senlac Ridge. Others attempted to escape individually, abandoning weapons and equipment as they fled. The Battle of Hastings was over. It had been a complete Norman victory, but only after one of the hardest-fought battles of the Middle Ages. Victory had never been guaranteed. Several moments during the day could easily have produced a different result. Had William failed to stop the panic after rumors of his death, his army might have dissolved. Had the English remained firmly behind their shield wall throughout the afternoon, the Norman assaults might eventually have failed altogether. The outcome balanced on remarkably small margins. Instead, William emerged victorious. When the fighting ended, he was no longer merely Duke of Normandy. He had taken the first and greatest step toward becoming ruler of England. Yet, the campaign itself was far from finished. Winning a battlefield and conquering a kingdom were not the same thing. Harold was dead, but London still stood unconquered. Powerful nobles remained alive. The English church continued to function, and large parts of the country had not yet recognized William's authority. The conquest still had to be completed. Unlike many victorious commanders, William refused to rush forward in celebration. He proceeded with characteristic caution. Before moving toward London, he ordered his men to bury the dead. Thousands of bodies covered the slopes of Senlac, making immediate burial both a practical necessity and a symbolic duty. William also vowed to establish a great abbey upon the battlefield in thanksgiving for the victory. Years later, Battle Abbey would rise on the very ground where the English king had fallen. The fate of Harold's body quickly became the subject of legend. Some chroniclers claimed Norman soldiers mutilated the corpse in anger after the battle. Others maintained that Harold's mother eventually recovered her son's remains for burial. Another tradition insisted that the body had been thrown into the sea. Because no universally accepted account survived, rumors flourished for generations. Stories spread that Harold had escaped the battlefield alive, abandoned his royal identity, and lived quietly as an anonymous pilgrim somewhere in Wessex. Such tales reflected popular hope more than historical reality. Harold Godwinson died at Hastings. With him ended the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingship of England. Within days, William resumed his advance. Curiously, he avoided the most direct road to London. Rather than marching straight toward the capital, he first secured the southeastern coast, moving from one important port to another. The strategy revealed William's remarkable patience. Control of the ports guaranteed communication with Normandy, protected his supply lines, and ensured that reinforcements could continue crossing the channel if necessary. Just as importantly, every town that surrendered weakened English confidence in continued resistance. Dover submitted without major fighting. William immediately strengthened its defenses. The town occupied one of the narrowest crossing points between England and the continent, making it indispensable for maintaining contact with Normandy. The old Roman lighthouse still stood nearby after centuries of use. Around it, William began constructing new defensive works that would become one of the strongest fortifications in England. Dover also carried political importance. William insisted that Harold's earlier oath had included permission for a Norman garrison there. Occupying the town therefore symbolized, in William's eyes at least, the fulfillment of promises Harold had broken. Next came Canterbury. Unlike Hastings, the city surrendered peacefully. Its importance extended far beyond military strategy. Canterbury had served as the spiritual center of English Christianity since the arrival of Augustine's mission centuries earlier. Possessing the city strengthened William's claim that his conquest also represented religious reform supported by the papacy. The Norman Duke understood symbolism as well as warfare. Holding Canterbury suggested that both God and the English Church now favored his rule. Meanwhile, English leaders struggled to respond. Harold's death had left the kingdom without an obvious successor. Archbishop Stigand, together with Archbishop Aldred of York and the surviving nobles, gathered in London to decide who should continue the resistance. Harold's sons were largely ignored. Although they possessed their father's blood, they lacked the dynastic legitimacy many leading nobles considered essential during such a crisis. Instead, attention turned to the ancient royal house of Wessex. The last surviving representative of that dynasty was Edgar Atheling. Edgar descended from Edmund Ironside and ultimately from Alfred the Great. His hereditary claims surpassed anyone else's. There was one serious problem. He was little more than a boy. Edgar possessed royal blood, but almost no military experience. England desperately needed a commander capable of confronting William, yet the strongest legal claimant had never led an army in battle. Nevertheless, legitimacy outweighed experience. Sometime during November, Edgar was acknowledged as king by leading English nobles. His reign existed largely in theory. He was never crowned. Before the necessary ceremonies could take place, William was already tightening his grip around London. Once again, the Norman Duke avoided reckless action. Rather than attacking the capital directly, he marched westward, staying south of the Thames before crossing the river near Wallingford. Only after securing that crossing did he begin advancing slowly toward London from the northwest. The strategy avoided an expensive siege. William understood that storming one of Europe's largest cities would cost enormous numbers of lives and perhaps destroy the very kingdom he wished to rule. Instead, he relied upon pressure. Day after day, his army moved closer. One by one, English leaders abandoned hope. Even Archbishop Stigand eventually submitted to William. The coalition supporting Edgar steadily dissolved. By the time William reached London's outskirts, organized resistance had almost disappeared. The city surrendered with remarkably little fighting. The nobles who had proclaimed Edgar only weeks earlier now accepted William instead. On Christmas Day, 1066, the Norman Duke entered Westminster Abbey. His choice of location carried profound significance. The church had been built by Edward the Confessor, the king whose succession lay at the heart of the entire conflict. By receiving the crown in Edward's own abbey, William presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as Edward's rightful successor. Norman cavalry surrounded the building throughout the ceremony. The precautions proved understandable. When English voices shouted their traditional acclamation for the new king, Norman soldiers outside mistakenly believed an uprising had begun. In panic, they set fire to nearby houses while rushing to defend the church. The coronation briefly descended into confusion before order was restored. Despite the chaos, the ceremony was completed. William, once mocked as William the Bastard during his youth, now became William I, King of England. Soon afterward, he ordered the construction of an enormous new fortress overlooking the Thames. Stone was transported from Caen in Normandy to build the White Tower, the central structure of what would later become the Tower of London. The castle served several purposes at once. It protected the capital, it intimidated potential rebels, and it proclaimed permanently that a new ruling dynasty had arrived. Not all England accepted William immediately. Northern regions, particularly Northumbria and Mercia, continued resisting Norman authority for several years. Rebellions erupted repeatedly, forcing William to return with overwhelming military force. His response was merciless. Entire districts were devastated, crops destroyed, villages burned, and populations driven into famine during what later became known as the Harrying of the North. The campaigns secured Norman rule, but they also established William's reputation as one of the harshest rulers of the medieval age. The Battle of Hastings had ended in a single day. The Norman conquest of England took years to complete. Yet by the close of 1066, one truth had become impossible to deny. The old Anglo-Saxon kingdom had fallen. In its place stood a new Norman monarchy whose influence would reshape England's language, government, aristocracy, architecture, and culture for centuries to come. The Battle of Hastings lasted only a single day. Roughly 14,000 men fought on Senlac Ridge, yet the consequences of their struggle reshaped England and influenced the development of Western Europe for centuries. Few battles in history have altered the political, cultural, and linguistic identity of an entire nation so completely. The first transformation occurred in government. William did not simply replace one king with another, he introduced an entirely different understanding of royal authority. Before 1066, England possessed a powerful monarchy, but that monarchy operated alongside influential earls and the Witan, the council of leading nobles and churchmen. Regional lords exercised considerable independence, often governing their territories with only limited interference from the crown. Kings relied heavily upon cooperation rather than absolute control. William intended to eliminate that balance. Drawing upon the administrative system he had already developed in Normandy, he strengthened the principles of feudal government and concentrated power in the hands of the monarch. Every important noble now owed loyalty directly to the king rather than through chains of competing obligations. Personal allegiance flowed upward to one supreme ruler instead of passing through multiple layers of authority. This seemingly technical change had enormous consequences. It prevented great nobles from developing independent power bases capable of rivaling the crown. Every estate, every title, and every privilege ultimately depended upon royal approval. William pushed the principle even further. He declared that all land within England belonged first to the crown. Noble families could receive estates, castles, and privileges, but only because the king granted them. Ownership itself flowed outward from the monarch. The relationship between ruler and kingdom had fundamentally changed. Future English kings inherited not only the throne, but also legal authority over every acre of the realm. Many later monarchs interpreted this principle aggressively, extending royal control over forests, rivers, hunting grounds, and other resources that earlier generations had used more freely. The legends surrounding Robin Hood emerged from this changing world. Although the historical origins of the famous outlaw remain uncertain, stories of Sherwood Forest reflected widespread resentment toward increasingly restrictive forest laws imposed under Norman rule. Activities that ordinary people had once considered traditional rights gradually became subject to royal permission. Architecture changed just as dramatically. Military conquest demanded permanent control, and permanent control demanded castles. The Anglo-Saxons had built fortified settlements before the conquest, but William introduced castle building on an entirely different scale. Across England, Norman engineers constructed defensive strongholds that dominated both towns and countryside. Many of these fortresses began as wooden earthwork castles built rapidly after the invasion. Over time, they were replaced by massive stone structures designed to intimidate local populations as much as repel military attacks. White limestone imported from Normandy became a distinctive feature of Norman construction. These castles were more than military installations. They served as administrative centers, residences for Norman nobles, symbols of royal authority, and constant reminders that England now possessed new rulers. The conquest also transformed England's place within European politics. William never surrendered his title as Duke of Normandy after becoming King of England. As a result, he occupied two remarkably different positions at the same time. Within England, he ruled as an independent sovereign. Within France, he technically remained a vassal, owing fealty to the French king for his Norman duchy. This unusual arrangement created lasting tensions. Future English kings inherited lands on both sides of the English Channel, forcing them to divide their attention between two political worlds. English rulers became deeply involved in continental affairs, while French kings constantly sought opportunities to weaken the enormous territories controlled by their powerful neighbors. The consequences lasted for centuries. Conflicts over these inherited possessions eventually contributed to some of the longest and most destructive wars in medieval Europe, including the 100 Years' War. The Norman elite also brought a different cultural identity. Many members of the new aristocracy considered themselves French rather than English. They spoke Norman French, followed continental customs, and maintained close ties with estates across the Channel. Even generations later, some English kings felt culturally closer to France than to England. Richard the Lionheart provides perhaps the best-known example. Although celebrated as one of England's greatest medieval monarchs, Richard spent relatively little time in England and spoke French far more comfortably than English. Language itself underwent a profound transformation. Before 1066, everyday speech throughout England consisted largely of Old English, a Germanic language shaped by centuries of Anglo-Saxon settlement and enriched by Scandinavian influence following the Viking Age. The Norman conquest did not replace that language. Instead, it layered another language upon it. French became the language of government, law, aristocratic society, diplomacy, literature, and the royal court. English remained the language of ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and village communities. For generations, the kingdom effectively spoke two languages. Gradually, the two traditions merged. Thousands of French words entered English vocabulary, especially in fields connected with government, justice, warfare, architecture, education, cuisine, and culture. The language that eventually emerged retained its Germanic foundation while absorbing an extraordinary number of Romance words. Modern English still reflects this mixture. Words inherited from Anglo-Saxon ancestors often describe everyday life, while many terms associated with government, law, and refined culture trace their origins to Norman French. William also revolutionized administration. He understood that effective government depended upon accurate information. A king could not tax wealth he could not measure. Nor could he reward loyal followers fairly without knowing exactly what lands existed, who possessed them, and what they produced. To solve this problem, William ordered one of the most remarkable administrative surveys of the medieval world. Royal officials traveled throughout England collecting astonishing amounts of information. They recorded land ownership, cultivated fields, villages, churches, mills, livestock, woodland, meadows, population, and taxable wealth. Few aspects of English economic life escaped investigation. The results were compiled into the Domesday Book. Completed in 1086, 20 years after Hastings, the survey represented an unprecedented attempt to catalogue an entire kingdom. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle emphasized the extraordinary thoroughness of the investigation. Officials examined virtually every estate, every hide of land, every major agricultural resource, and countless domestic animals. Contemporary observers regarded the process as almost unbelievably comprehensive. The comparison with the Last Judgment soon became unavoidable. Just as no soul could escape God's final accounting, no landowner seemed able to escape William's officials. Hence, the survey acquired the name Domesday. Its practical value was immense. For the first time, the English monarchy possessed a detailed record of the kingdom's economic resources. Taxes could be assessed with far greater precision, disputes over ownership could be investigated, and royal revenues increased dramatically. William became not merely one of Europe's strongest rulers, but also one of its wealthiest. His financial power rested less upon England's natural riches than upon his government's remarkable ability to measure and administer them. The Domesday Book also became an irreplaceable historical source. Through its pages, historians can reconstruct villages, farming methods, patterns of landholding, population distribution, and local economies with extraordinary detail. It remains one of the greatest surviving administrative documents from medieval Europe. The conquest affected Scandinavia as well. The Norwegian fleet that departed England after Stamford Bridge bore little resemblance to the magnificent armada that had crossed the North Sea only weeks earlier. Contemporary accounts suggest that roughly 240 ships carried Harold Hardrada's invasion force to England. Only about 24 were needed to transport the survivors home. Among those survivors was Harold's younger son, Olaf. Following his father's death, Olaf initially ruled Norway together with his older brother Magnus. Their joint kingship lasted only a short time before Magnus died, leaving Olaf as sole ruler. The contrast between father and son could hardly have been greater. Harald Hardrada had spent much of his life seeking glory through warfare. Olaf devoted his reign to peace. Later generations remembered him as Olaf the Peaceful. During more than 2 decades on the throne, he avoided major wars and concentrated instead on strengthening the kingdom internally. Trade expanded, prosperity increased, and everyday life gradually became more settled. Norwegian society itself reflected the change. Royal residences became more comfortable, with improved heating systems replacing older arrangements. Drinking horns increasingly gave way to cups and beakers, more typical of continental Europe. These details may appear minor, yet together they reveal a broader transformation. Norway slowly ceased to define itself primarily through Viking expansion. Instead, it became a stable Christian kingdom firmly integrated into the political and cultural life of medieval Europe. One final legacy deserves special recognition. Within a generation of Hastings, artists produced one of the most remarkable visual records ever created for a medieval historical event. The Bayeux Tapestry is not merely an artistic masterpiece. It functions as a narrative stretching across more than 200 feet of embroidered cloth, depicting ships, castles, warriors, horses, kings, battles, ordinary civilians, and even the famous appearance of Halley's Comet. Although created from a Norman perspective and intended to celebrate William's victory, it preserves countless details that written chronicles never recorded. Weapons, armor, hairstyles, clothing, ships, architecture, military formations, agricultural life, religious ceremonies, and moments of human emotion all survive within its embroidered scenes. Few medieval events possess such a vivid visual companion. Nearly 1,000 years after the conquest, viewers can still follow the story almost scene by scene, much as audiences today follow a historical film or documentary. The Battle of Hastings did far more than replace one dynasty with another. It reorganized the English state, strengthened royal authority, transformed aristocratic society, reshaped architecture, altered the English language, revolutionized government administration, redirected Scandinavian history, and permanently connected England to the political struggles of continental Europe. Few battles have changed so much in so little time. For England, October 14th, 1066, marked the end of one age and the beginning of another. Its consequences have never entirely disappeared.